Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've always preferred camping alone. There's something about being out in the wilderness, miles from anyone else, that clears my head. No noise, no responsibilities, just me and the trees, the stars, and the crackle of a fire. I've done it dozens of times, and it's always been peaceful. Until last weekend. I found this spot online, mentioned in a few obscure camping forums. It wasn't on any official map, and the directions were vague. Just follow the old logging road until it ends, then hike a couple of miles west. That's the kind of isolation I craved, so I packed my gear, threw it in my truck, and headed out. The drive was long, winding deeper into the mountains, the road getting rougher and narrower as I went. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt, and finally, it wasn't much more than a path between the trees. No signs, no mile markers, just forest. When the road ended, I parked, grabbed my pack, and set off into the woods, the excitement of solitude buzzing in my chest. The hike in was beautiful. Thick pines towering above, the underbrush thick but manageable. The air was crisp, the sun filtering through the trees in golden rays. After about 2 hours of walking, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing near a stream with a natural ring of trees that made it feel almost cozy. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the woods grew darker and the air cooler. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, enjoying the quiet. There's something about the silence out there that feels different. In the city, silence is rare, always interrupted by cars or distant voices. But here it was pure, just the rustling of leaves, the gurgling of the stream, the crackling fire. By the time night fully settled in, I was ready to sleep. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The stillness outside was comforting at first. No animals, no wind, just the deep, quiet forest. But sometime around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay there in the dark, blinking, trying to shake off the grogginess. My mind struggled to latch onto anything. And then I realized the woods were too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds, the rustling, the distant calls of owls or coyotes, were gone. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to spook yourself when you're alone. But then I heard it. A soft shuffle, like something moving through the underbrush. Close, too close. I froze, every muscle tensing. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, as though someone or something was walking just beyond the edge of my camp. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. My hand groped for the flashlight by my side, fingers trembling. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the tent's zipper. Another step, closer this time. I unzipped the tent just an inch, enough to peer out into the dark. The beam of my flashlight cut through the blackness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Then it stopped. The shuffling, the crunching, silence. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, flashlight shaking in my hand, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. After a long time, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe a deer, curious about the camp, nothing dangerous. I zipped the tent back up, turned off the light, and lay down, though sleep didn't come easily after that. I must have dozed off eventually because when I woke again it was still dark, and I immediately felt it. That sense of something being wrong. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening. That's when I heard it again. Not the shuffling this time, but breathing. Deep, slow breaths, just outside the tent. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was standing just outside. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I just lay there, listening, my entire body frozen in terror. The breathing was so close I could almost feel it. Slow, heavy, like someone taking long measured breaths right next to the thin fabric of my tent. I wanted to scream. I wanted to bolt out of the tent and run, but I couldn't. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. For what felt like hours, the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it an animal? A person? Was someone out there, just standing, watching me? Suddenly the breathing stopped. I didn't dare move. I lay there, counting the seconds, the minutes, waiting for something to happen. But the forest was silent again. No footsteps, no shuffling, just silence. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the courage to move. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I unzipped the tent, slowly, and shined the light outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood tall and still, their shadows long and dark in the beam of my light. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there huddled in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of a branch, set my nerves on edge. But nothing else happened. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast or even putting out the fire properly. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward my truck, the forest felt different. The sense of peace I had always loved about camping was gone, replaced by a feeling of unease, like I was being watched. Every now and then I would glance behind me, half expecting to see someone standing in the distance, but there was never anyone there. I reached the truck, threw my gear in the back, and peeled out of there, my heart still racing. I didn't look back once. It's been a few days now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. I don't know what it was, an animal, a person, or something else entirely. But every night since then, when I lie down to sleep, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, deliberate breathing just outside my window. I don't know why I agreed to go camping with Sam in the first place. He was always into the extreme stuff, climbing mountains without ropes, kayaking in rivers that should have killed him, trekking through places no sane person would go. But when he called me that Friday afternoon telling me he found the perfect spot in the deep woods, miles from any marked trail, I couldn't say no. Something about his enthusiasm was infectious. We packed up quickly, loading our gear into Sam's beat-up truck and driving for hours into the mountains. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line by the time we reached the dirt road that led to his perfect spot. The road was narrow and overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years. The deeper we drove, the denser the forest became, swallowing up the light. Finally, we parked by what was barely recognizable as a trailhead, just a gap between the trees. Sam was practically bouncing with excitement. "Come on, man, you're gonna love this. It's completely off the grid, untouched by people for decades." We hiked for what felt like hours, the trail growing fainter with every step. The deeper we went, the more suffocating the air became, thick with the scent of damp earth and moss. The trees were enormous, their branches twisted and knotted like they'd been there for centuries. It was as if time had forgotten this place. Eventually, we reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches so thick overhead that barely any light filtered through. The place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. Sam dropped his pack and grinned. "Told you it was perfect, didn't I?" I forced a smile, but something about the place felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed too still, too stagnant, like the forest was holding its breath. But Sam was already setting up camp, so I pushed the feeling aside. By the time we had the tent pitched and the fire going, the sun had fully set, plunging the forest into darkness. The firelight flickered weakly against the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that danced like figures just out of sight. As we sat by the fire, Sam told stories, wild adventures he'd been on, the crazy things he'd done. But I wasn't really listening. My attention kept drifting to the forest, to the darkness beyond the firelight. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting between the trees. After a while, Sam noticed my unease. "Hey man, you good?" I hesitated, glancing around the clearing again. "Yeah, it's just... Doesn't it feel off to you?" He laughed, brushing it off. "Nah, dude. You're just not used to being this deep in the woods. It's peaceful. Nothing but nature out here." I wanted to believe him, but the silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. A few hours passed and the fire started to die down. Sam decided to head to the tent for the night, but I couldn't sleep. Something kept gnawing at me, that feeling of wrongness growing stronger with every passing minute. I sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers when I heard it. A faint sound, a low, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the breeze. At first I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't natural. It was a voice. No, voices. Multiple, soft, overlapping, just beyond the edge of hearing. I stood up, straining to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers seemed to come from the trees, from all around me, like the forest itself was murmuring. "Sam?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I turned back toward the tent, but it was still. Too still. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the tent, unzipping it as quietly as I could. Sam was inside, lying on his side, his back to me. "Sam, did you hear that?" I whispered. Nothing. He didn't move. "Sam?" I said again, a little louder this time. I reached out to shake his shoulder, but when I touched him, he felt wrong. Cold. Too cold. I turned him over, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at the roof of the tent. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted. He wasn't breathing. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled back out of the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. This didn't make sense. Sam had been fine just an hour ago. He couldn't be... He wasn't dead. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't just cast by the firelight. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, between the trees circling the camp. Figures. Tall, thin, barely more than silhouettes, but unmistakable. They stood just beyond the reach of my flashlight, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder. I turned and bolted, running blindly into the forest. Branches whipped at my face, my legs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps, soft but deliberate, following me. I don't know how long I ran. The trees closed in around me, the darkness pressing down, suffocating. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding me, overlapping voices, whispering words I couldn't understand. My head was spinning, my heart racing, and then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight flying from my hand and skidding across the dirt. The light flickered once, then went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I lay there gasping for breath, too terrified to move, and then I felt it. Something cold, impossibly cold, brushed against the back of my neck. The whispers stopped. I slowly turned my head, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. And there, in the darkness, inches from my face, was a figure. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long, its face pale and featureless, like a mask. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with empty, hollow eyes. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no sense to it. The thing didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. As I backed away, more figures emerged from the trees surrounding me. All of them tall, thin, their faces featureless, their bodies unnaturally still. I turned to run, but no matter which direction I moved, there was always one of them in my way, standing silently, waiting. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. And then I realized something. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to warn me. The cold breath on the back of my neck. That hadn't been them. That had been something else. Something worse. I stopped, frozen in place, my body trembling. I could feel it behind me, just inches away, breathing down my neck. Something dark and ancient and angry. I didn't have time to scream before it took me. I don't know why I agreed to it. Camping was never really my thing. I liked comfort, soft beds, 4 walls, Wi-Fi. But when my buddy Tom said he found this hidden gem deep in the wilderness, a place nobody knew about, something inside me clicked. Maybe it was the promise of isolation, the allure of a weekend without stress. Or maybe I just didn't want to be the only one chickening out. There were 4 of us, Tom, Sarah, Dave, and me. We left early, driving hours out of town, deeper than I thought possible. The road eventually turned to gravel, then dirt, until finally we parked the truck at the trailhead, where the forest swallowed the rest of the world whole. Tom led the way, his usual cocky grin plastered across his face. He'd been hyping this spot for weeks, talking about how it wasn't on any maps, how it was the most serene place he'd ever stumbled across. "Just wait," he'd said. "No one else will be there. It'll be just us in the woods." And he was right. After hiking for hours, we arrived at a small overgrown clearing surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. It was silent, too silent. Not even the sound of birds. The only thing breaking the stillness was the occasional crack of twigs underfoot. The place felt untouched, pristine almost, but something about it made my stomach churn. Tom dropped his pack and spread his arms wide. "What did I tell you? Perfect, right?" We all nodded, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I ignored it, told myself I was just being paranoid. We set up camp, and soon the fire was crackling, casting a warm glow that pushed the shadows back into the trees. The quiet unease faded for a while, replaced by the comfort of laughter, old stories, and the smell of burning wood. As night fell, the woods seemed to close in on us. The fire's light only reached so far, and beyond it, the trees stood like silent sentinels, watching. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, on the voices of my friends. But every now and then, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the light. Just a flicker, like a shadow, darting between the trunks. It was Dave who broke the spell first. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low, tense. We all paused, listening. At first there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then I heard it too, faint but unmistakable. A rustling, like footsteps. But they weren't coming from the trail we'd hiked in on. They were coming from deeper in the woods, from the direction we hadn't explored. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We all tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. The air felt heavier, colder. We decided to call it a night soon after, retreating to our tents. Tom and Dave shared one, Sarah and I another. The fire flickered out, and the darkness pressed in, thick and impenetrable. I lay there staring up at the tent's nylon ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. Rustling leaves, the creaking of tree branches swaying in the breeze. But every now and then there was something else. A sound that didn't belong. A whisper. I thought I was imagining it at first. Just the wind, I told myself. But it wasn't the wind. It was too soft, too deliberate. It was a voice, murmuring just beyond the tent. I held my breath, straining to hear, but it stopped as quickly as it started. I glanced over at Sarah. She was fast asleep. I didn't wake her. I figured I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A whisper, right outside the tent. I shot up, my heart racing. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, my hand gripping the flashlight. I shone the light into the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the cold, silent woods. I laid back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Hours passed. And then, sometime in the early morning, the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp. I knew Tom and Dave must have heard them too, but no one said a word. I didn't dare move. At some point, the footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It stretched on for what felt like forever, until finally, I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was barely dawn, the sky a dull gray. I crawled out of the tent, my muscles stiff, my nerves on edge. Tom was already awake, staring out into the woods, his usual cockiness gone. "I saw something last night," he said quietly, not looking at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" "Out there." He nodded toward the trees. "I don't know what it was, but it was watching us." My stomach dropped. Before I could respond, Sarah and Dave emerged from their tents, both looking equally shaken. None of us spoke about the noises, the whispers, but I could see it in their faces. They had heard it too. We packed up quickly, eager to leave. The trail out felt longer than before, the trees seeming to close in around us. The whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had circled our camp was still following us, just out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the truck. We threw our gear in the back and piled in, desperate to get out of there. But as Tom turned the key, the truck sputtered and died. He tried again and again, but it wouldn't start. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, checking the dashboard. The gas gauge was empty. We'd filled it before we left. Panic set in as we realized we were stranded. We sat in silence for a moment, the woods pressing in around us. Then, from the trees, we heard it again, the whispering. Faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, and they were getting closer. Sarah started crying. Dave frantically checked his phone, but there was no signal. Tom was swearing under his breath, trying the engine one more time, but it was useless. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped. The woods were silent again. But it wasn't comforting. It felt wrong. I looked out the window, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And then slowly it smiled. The last thing I remember is the sound of the truck engine roaring to life. I've always loved the idea of camping in the wild, being out there away from everything where you can breathe and just exist. That's what made me jump at the chance when my friend Marcus suggested a weekend trip deep in the Smoky Mountains. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. We left early on a Friday, 4 of us crammed into Marcus's SUV, loaded with gear and high spirits. Along with Marcus, there was Jess, who always had the best ghost stories. And Ethan, our comic relief, the guy who could turn any tense situation into a joke. And then there was me, just hoping for some peace and quiet away from the buzz of life. The drive up the mountain took longer than expected. Roads twisted and turned, narrowing into rough, unmarked trails. The further we got, the fewer signs of civilization there were. Cell signals faded into nothing, and soon it was just us surrounded by endless stretches of dense trees, tall and dark like silent sentinels. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally over the forest floor. The campsite itself was nothing more than a small clearing, barely big enough for our 2 tents. It was hemmed in by a thick wall of trees that felt too close. The air was cooler here, the kind that presses against your skin like a warning, but Marcus was unfazed. "This is the spot," he said, grinning. "No one will find us here." We set up camp as the last of the light disappeared. Jess and I gathered firewood while Marcus and Ethan wrestled with the tents. The quiet was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. A silence so deep it swallowed everything. That night around the fire, the mood shifted. The usual banter was subdued. The crackling of the flames sounded louder than it should have, each snap echoing through the trees like it was the only sound for miles. Jess broke the silence, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you guys feel like we're being watched?" Ethan snorted. Classic Jess, can't resist creeping us out. But no one laughed. Even Marcus's smile faltered. "I'm serious," she continued, staring into the dark woods just beyond the glow of the fire. "There's something out there." I followed her gaze, but all I saw were trees, endless and impenetrable. But the more I stared, the more wrong they seemed. Their shapes didn't line up. Branches seemed to shift. Shadows flickered where there was no light. I felt a cold dread slither down my spine, something primal whispering that we weren't alone. The first incident happened that night. I woke up to the sound of rustling, soft at first, like something dragging through the underbrush. I lay still, my ears straining to hear. Then it grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of that. I nudged Marcus, who was snoring beside me in the tent. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He grunted, but didn't wake. The noise outside was getting closer. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, peeking out into the darkness. The fire had long since died, leaving everything pitch black. But the sound, it was right there, just beyond the trees. Something big was moving. My heart raced. Then, silence. I stared into the black void, half expecting something to leap out at me, but there was nothing. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my skin prickling, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. The next morning, Ethan was gone. At first, we thought he was just messing with us, typical Ethan, we figured. But after an hour of calling his name, trekking through the woods, we realized something was very, very wrong. His backpack was still there, his boots too. He wouldn't have gone far without them. "Maybe he's playing some kind of prank," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes kept darting to the trees. By noon, panic had set in. Jess was near tears, pacing around the campsite, her eyes wide, darting around like she expected Ethan to jump out at any moment. But I knew better. Something had happened. The woods felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating, like we were trespassers in a place we didn't belong. And whatever owned this place, it didn't want us here. By dusk, we heard it again. The same rustling, circling us, moving through the underbrush. But this time it was faster, more agitated. I could see Marcus gripping his knife, his knuckles white. Jess refused to leave the fire, her face pale and drawn. Then, out of nowhere, Marcus stood up. "We have to find him," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't just—" He never finished his sentence. A blur shot out from the trees, something dark and impossibly fast, and Marcus was gone. One moment he was there, and the next the spot where he'd stood was empty, save for the knife he'd dropped. We didn't sleep that night. Jess and I sat with our backs to the fire, gripping the hatchet, our eyes scanning the woods, every crack of a branch sending us into a panic. But nothing came. Nothing except that creeping sense that something was watching, waiting. Morning came, but it didn't bring safety. Jess was the next to vanish. One minute she was gathering wood for the fire, and the next her scream tore through the forest. I ran toward the sound, but when I got there, the ground was disturbed, her footprints trailing into the trees, and then nothing. Just silence. I was alone. That was when I noticed something I hadn't before. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches or disturbed leaves. It was as if Jess had simply walked into the forest and disappeared. Like Marcus. Like Ethan. That's when it hit me. I knew this place. It wasn't the first time I'd been here. Memories came flooding back, fragmented and buried deep. I had been here before, years ago, and the people with me then, they'd vanished too. Just like this. Because they weren't taken by something in the woods. They were taken by the woods. I'm not sure why I'm the one who always survives, why the woods let me go when they take the others. But it happens every time. I lure them here, unknowingly, until they're swallowed up, and I'm left alone, waiting for the next group of friends who want to escape into the wilderness. Because this place, it's not just alive, it's hungry, and now I'm already thinking about who I can bring next. We thought it was a good idea. Just a weekend camping trip, deep in the woods, far from civilization, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, Trevor, Jamie, and Kayla, a tight-knit group of friends looking for a break from the monotony of life. The trip was Trevor's idea. He'd found this place after scrolling through obscure hiking forums, a dense mist-covered forest that barely showed up on maps. It was supposed to be a hidden gem. The drive took longer than expected. As we veered off the main roads, the trees seemed to close in, swallowing the car in thick, towering walls of green. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping behind the horizon and a thin fog had begun to creep between the trees. It wasn't unusual for forests like this, or so we told ourselves. We unloaded our gear quickly, eager to set up camp before darkness completely took over. The first few hours were normal. We laughed around the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and shared ghost stories. But then, as the night wore on, an unnatural stillness settled in. The usual chorus of crickets, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls. Gone. The silence was so thick, it pressed against my ears, making me uncomfortable. I didn't say anything, but I could tell the others felt it too. Kayla kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. Trevor, always the skeptic, shrugged it off. "It's probably just the mist," he said. "Dampened sound." But the quiet wasn't the only thing wrong. The mist seemed to be moving in strange ways, swirling and coiling between the trees as if it were alive, creeping closer to our campsite in slow, deliberate waves. When Jamie went to fetch more firewood, he came back pale and shaking, though he swore he was fine. It wasn't until later, when we were settling into our tents, that the real strangeness began. I woke up in the middle of the night to the soft sound of footsteps just outside my tent. They were slow, methodical, and distinctly human. At first I thought it was one of my friends, maybe Trevor, checking on something. But when I called out, the footsteps stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. I stuck my head out of the tent flap, but there was no one there. Just the mist, thick and impenetrable, curling around the base of the trees. I checked the others. Trevor was asleep in his tent, snoring lightly. Kayla and Jamie, too, were tucked away. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, until I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the campsite, standing in the mist, was a figure. It was faint, barely visible through the swirling fog, but unmistakably there. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. A deep chill ran through me, and I scrambled back into my tent, heart pounding. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was tired and seeing things that weren't there. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I asked the others if they'd seen or heard anything. Kayla admitted she'd woken up to the same sound of footsteps, but Jamie and Trevor shrugged it off. "Probably animals," Trevor said. But Kayla and I exchanged uneasy looks. This forest felt wrong. Throughout the day, the sense of being watched grew stronger. We hiked deeper into the woods, hoping to shake off the unease, but no matter where we went, it felt like something was following us. Every so often I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, the faint outline of that same figure, always just out of focus. When I turned to look directly, it was gone. By the time we made it back to camp, the mist had thickened into a dense, suffocating blanket. Kayla was on edge, her usual bubbly self gone. Even Trevor was quieter than usual, casting nervous glances at the trees. That night, everything went to hell. It started with the fire. One moment it was crackling normally, the next it sputtered out as if snuffed by an invisible hand. We scrambled to relight it, but the air was thick and damp, making it impossible. The cold seeped in and the silence returned, deeper, heavier than before. Then, without warning, Kayla screamed. We whipped around to find her staring at something just beyond the campsite. There, standing in the mist, were figures, dozens of them. They were pale, ghostly outlines of people, men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, watching us with hollow, dark eyes. Trevor yelled, grabbing a flashlight and shining it at them, but the light passed right through. The figures didn't move, didn't react, just stared. And then, as if on cue, objects around the camp began to shift. Our backpacks slid across the ground, the tents collapsed in on themselves, and the air grew colder, freezing our breath in front of our faces. In a blind panic, we tried to flee, but no matter which direction we ran, the mist thickened, swallowing us whole. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I tripped, falling hard, and when I looked up, the figures were closer, circling us. Their faces were clearer now, twisted, distorted, as if they had been stretched and warped. Suddenly Jamie screamed, a guttural, animalistic sound. His body convulsed, and then he was gone, pulled into the mist, his scream echoing through the trees. We ran, blindly crashing through the underbrush, but the figures followed, relentless, silent. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of a clearing, panting, terrified. But as we collapsed to the ground, a horrifying realization dawned on me. This clearing wasn't new. It was our campsite. Somehow we had been running in circles, and that's when I noticed the tent, our tent. But there were people inside, people who looked just like us. My blood ran cold as I watched, frozen in horror, as the version of me in the tent stirred, sat up, and looked out, directly at me. The others saw it too. There we were, all four of us, sitting around the campfire as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't us. It couldn't be. Trevor moved first, slowly approaching the doppelgangers, but the moment he stepped closer, they looked up in unison, their faces breaking into grotesque, unnatural smiles. Then, without warning, the doppelgangers stood and walked into the mist, vanishing as if they had never been there at all. The silence that followed was suffocating. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate. And then a voice, cold and unfamiliar, whispered from the trees, "You shouldn't have come." We never saw Jamie again. The rest of us escaped the forest the next day, though escaped isn't the right word. Something followed us out. Something wrong. I can feel it even now as I write this, watching me from the corner of the room, always just out of sight. I'm not sure we ever truly left the forest, and I'm not sure we ever will. I had always prided myself on being able to handle solitude. I thrived in it, really. It cleared my head and helped me think. So, when the idea of a solo camping trip hit me, it seemed like a perfect way to unwind. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. It was something I had always wanted to try, but I hadn't gotten around to it. Until now. I chose a spot I'd read about in some backcountry forums, one of those hidden gem locations that only serious hikers knew about. No marked trails, no campgrounds, just pure wilderness. The directions were simple enough. Head down an old logging road until it dead ends, hike west for a couple of hours, and you'll find a small lake surrounded by dense forest. I was sold. The drive took most of the day. As the road got rougher, I saw fewer signs of civilization until there was nothing but trees and sky. I reached the end of the logging road as the sun was beginning to set. With the last bit of daylight, I grabbed my pack and headed into the forest, following the vague directions I had printed out. By the time I found the lake, the sun had sunk low and the sky was a deep orange. The lake was small, almost perfectly round, its water dark and still, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. It was beautiful, isolated, perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, and got a small fire going just as the last light faded from the sky. The forest around me was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no birds, no rustling of small animals, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional ripple on the lake's surface. I figured it was just because I was so deep in the woods, far from any trails or people. The animals were probably more cautious around here. As I sat by the fire eating my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence felt too thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was just adjusting to being alone in such a remote place. I wasn't used to this level of quiet. Still, it gnawed at me, that sense of something being slightly wrong. After a couple of hours of staring into the flames, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The night was utterly black outside, the kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I lay there, listening to the nothingness, trying to let the steady rhythm of my breathing lull me to sleep. And then I heard it, a soft splash. My heart jumped and I strained my ears listening for more. At first I told myself it was just something falling into the lake, a fish maybe. But then it came again. Another splash followed by the faintest sound of something shifting, like wet fabric being dragged across the ground. I sat up, my pulse racing, ears straining to pick up any sound. The forest outside was still pitch black, the fire long since extinguished. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the lake. Nothing. The water was still, like glass. The trees stood tall and silent, their reflections unbroken in the dark mirror of the lake. But that sound, it hadn't been my imagination. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the steady hum of the wind through the pines. I scanned the beam of my flashlight across the shore, expecting to see an animal or maybe a tree branch that had fallen into the water. But everything looked untouched. I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. I'd been on edge all day, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Satisfied that there was nothing out there, I lay back down and tried to get comfortable again. But just as I started to relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer. A soft, deliberate splash followed by the distinct sound of something moving along the shore. Slow, wet footsteps. They stopped just beyond my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. I gripped the flashlight tightly in my hand, the beam still off as I lay there, listening to whatever was outside. For a moment there was silence, then a soft brushing sound like fabric dragging against the canvas of my tent. It was right outside. My mind raced. What was it? A bear? No, bears don't move like that. A person. But why would anyone be out here, at this hour, in a place so remote? And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help. Me. It was a whisper, strained and distant, but it was there, just on the other side of the tent wall. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. Everything in me screamed to unzip the tent and run, but I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time closer. Help! Me! Please! I sat up, my hands trembling, and flicked on the flashlight. I aimed it toward the tent flap, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, was out there. But the voice had fallen silent again. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent, just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the shore of the lake. but there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing. The water was as still as ever, the trees unmoving. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I scanned the area again with the flashlight, feeling my heart pound in my chest, and that's when I saw it, something glistening on the ground near the edge of the lake. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, my body tense, and approached the spot, keeping the flashlight steady. The closer I got, the more I could see. It was a wet, dark patch in the dirt, like something had been dragged out of the water and across the shore. The trail led to the lake, and as my eyes followed the path, I saw something floating just beneath the surface of the water. A face, pale, bloated, staring up at me with empty, lifeless eyes. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my mind reeling. The figure in the water didn't move, didn't blink, just floated there, half submerged, staring at me from the depths. I ran back to the tent, grabbing my pack and yanking it on. I didn't care about the rest of my gear. I didn't care about the fire or the tent. I just needed to get out of there. As I sprinted toward the forest, I heard it again behind me from the lake. "Help me." The voice was louder this time, more desperate. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I reached my truck, the sun was just beginning to rise. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from that lake. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't tell anyone the full story when they ask why I've stopped camping alone. They wouldn't believe me if I did. But I still hear that voice sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment. Help me. I wasn't supposed to go camping that weekend. My friend Nate had begged me to come along, but something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the usual spot we went to. This one was deep in the forest, way off the beaten path. No cell service, no other campers for miles. Just thick woods and a small, secluded lake. Nate loved that kind of isolation. Me, not so much. But he wore me down. He promised it would be fun. Just a couple of nights away from civilization. A few beers by the fire, maybe some fishing. He said the spot was perfect, untouched, like stepping back in time. And that's exactly what it felt like when we arrived. The forest there was old, not just old, but ancient. The kind of place that felt heavy, like it had secrets buried deep in its roots. As we hiked in, the trees towered over us, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. It was almost like they were leaning in, watching. I kept my head down, trying to ignore the feeling of unease gnawing at the back of my mind. By the time we reached the lake, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. It was beautiful, but in that eerie, untouched way, like it hadn't seen a human presence in centuries. Nate, of course, was thrilled. He dropped his pack, stretched his arms wide, and declared it the best campsite ever. I wasn't so sure. We set up camp near the lake, built a fire, and cracked open a couple of beers. Nate was in his element, talking about all the things he wanted to do. Fishing, hiking deeper into the woods, maybe even staying an extra night. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no insects, just the occasional creak of the trees as the wind moved through them. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was watching us from the shadows just beyond the firelight. That's when Nate brought up the old story. "You know the legend of this place, right?" he asked, a grin spreading across his face. He loved this kind of stuff. Spooky stories, urban legends, anything to get a rise out of me. I shook my head, not really in the mood for it. "Don't tell me. Let me guess. Haunted forest, cursed lake, something creepy in the woods?" He laughed. "Close. They say a long time ago, some settlers came through here, back when the area was still being explored. They tried to settle near the lake, but something went wrong. People started disappearing. Some were found later wandering the woods totally out of it. like they'd lost their minds. Others, they just vanished. I rolled my eyes, though the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. So, what happened to them? Nate shrugged, his grin fading slightly. No one really knows. Some say they were driven mad by something out here, something in the woods. Others say they were taken. Taken by what? I asked, unable to stop myself. Nate glanced at the trees, the firelight flickering in his eyes. The forest itself. They say it's alive, that it watches anyone who comes here. And if it doesn't want you here, well, it takes you. I laughed, trying to break the tension, but the sound came out foresaid. Right. Well, let's hope the forest likes Oos, then. He smirked, but I could tell the story had gotten under his skin too. We didn't talk much after that, just sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the trees. That's when I heard it, a faint sound barely audible over the wind. It was a soft, distant humming, like someone singing far away. I straightened up, thinking maybe it was the wind playing tricks on my ears, but it kept going, growing louder. Nate, do you hear that? I whispered. He nodded, his face pale in the firelight. Yeah, it's coming from the woods. We both turned toward the tree line, staring into the darkness. The sound was growing clearer now. It wasn't just humming. It was a voice, a woman's voice, singing something slow and haunting, the melody twisting through the trees like a snake. My heart started to pound. Who the hell would be out here? Nate shook his head. No one. No one's supposed to be out here but us. The voice was getting closer, but we still couldn't see anything. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to shift and move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and that gut feeling, the one I'd had since we arrived, was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. Maybe it's someone who got lost, Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight, shining it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone, just the trees, standing like silent sentinels. Then, the voice stopped. Dead silence. I lowered the flashlight, my heart still racing. Maybe we should... A loud snap came from the trees behind us, like a branch breaking underfoot. We both spun around, shining our lights in the direction of the sound. But again, nothing. No one. Just the forest. Nate, we should go, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Now. He didn't argue. We started packing up as fast as we could, throwing things into our bags without bothering to organize. The air felt heavy, thick, like we were being watched from all sides. The trees seemed closer now, like they'd moved in while we weren't looking, their branches twisting together, blocking out the sky. As we grabbed the last of our gear, the voice started again, closer this time. It was right at the edge of the lake. We turned, and there, standing on the water, not in it but on it, was a figure, a woman, or at least what looked like a woman. She was pale, her skin almost glowing in the darkness, her hair hanging wet and limp around her face. She stood perfectly still, her feet just inches above the water's surface, and she was staring right at us. I froze. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. People don't stand on water. They don't look like that. Nate, I croaked, my throat tight. But Nate was already moving, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the trail. We didn't look back. We just ran, our footsteps pounding against the dirt, the sound of our breath ragged and panicked in the cold night air. The singing followed us, fainter now but still there, echoing through the trees. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We threw our gear in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped away. Neither of us said a word for the first hour of the drive. Finally, Nate broke the silence. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. I didn't know. All I knew was that something was out there, something that didn't want us in those woods. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching us. Even now, weeks later, I still hear that faint, haunting melody in my dreams. And I haven't been camping since. The first few hours of the camping trip were like any other. We hiked deep into the forest, far away from the crowded campsites and well-trodden trails, determined to find somewhere secluded. It was just me, my best friend Eric, and his girlfriend Megan. The three of us had planned this trip for weeks, a quick weekend getaway to escape our busy lives. We found the perfect spot, an open clearing surrounded by thick trees with a small, bubbling creek nearby. The sound of the water was calming, and the air smelled like pine and earth. The first night we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under a blanket of stars. Everything felt right, peaceful, but that feeling didn't last. It started in the middle of the second night. I woke up in my tent to the sound of something moving outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe some branches scraping against each other. But the longer I lay there listening, the more I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They crunched softly over the dried leaves, circled the camp, and then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but there was only silence. After a few moments, I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or some other curious creature. I forced myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. Something felt off, like the air had shifted. Heavy, oppressive. The next morning over breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard anything. Eric shook his head, focused on cooking eggs over the fire. Megan, though, frowned, her eyes darting toward the tree line. I thought I heard something too, she said quietly, like someone walking around the tents. Eric laughed. Probably just a raccoon or something. These woods are full of animals. But the look on Megan's face told me she wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. That afternoon, we decided to explore deeper into the forest, following the creek upstream. It was beautiful, serene, the kind of place you see on postcards. But as we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, expecting to see someone or something behind us, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. About an hour into the hike, we stumbled across something strange. An old, dilapidated cabin, half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was rotting, the roof caved in on one side. There was no sign of a path or road leading to it, and it definitely wasn't on the map we brought. "Whoa," Eric said, stepping closer. "How do you think this got here?" "Maybe it's an old ranger cabin," Megan suggested, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Or a hunting lodge." We circled the structure, curiosity getting the better of us. I peeked through one of the broken windows, half expecting to see nothing but cobwebs and decay. But inside, there were strange carvings on the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the wood, like someone had deliberately carved them there. "Let's go in," Eric said, already moving toward the door. "Are you serious?" Megan shot back, her tone sharp. "That place looks like it's ready to collapse." Eric waved her off. "Come on, it's just a quick look. We'll be fine." Reluctantly, Megan and I followed him inside. The air in the cabin was thick, musty, with a faint, sour smell that made my stomach turn. The carvings on the walls were even stranger up close. Spirals, jagged lines, symbols that felt wrong, somehow. "This is creepy," Megan muttered, rubbing her arms as if the temperature had dropped. Eric, unfazed, wandered further inside, but I stayed by the door, unease settling deep in my gut. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was hiding a secret, something we weren't supposed to see. That's when we found the trapdoor. It was half buried beneath a pile of debris, but Eric spotted the edge and cleared the rest of it off. The wooden door was old, splintered, with a rusted metal handle. "No way," I said, backing up. We are not going down there. Eric, of course, was already pulling the trapdoor open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The smell that wafted up was worse than the mustiness in the cabin. It was foul, like something had died down there. "Eric, don't," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just go back to camp." Eric paused, looking down into the dark void, and for a moment I thought he was going to listen to her. But then he smirked. "What's the worst that could happen?" He took a step down, then another. "Eric," I called, but my voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the cabin itself. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Megan and me standing there, our hearts pounding. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then nothing. No sound. No movement. "Eric," Megan called, her voice shaking. "This isn't funny." I grabbed my flashlight and shined it down the stairs. The beam barely penetrated the thick darkness below. "Megan, wait here, I'll go get him." Before she could protest, I started down the stairs, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. The steps creaked under my weight, and the foul smell grew stronger with every breath. As I reached the bottom, my flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. But then, as the light blinked back to life, I saw it. Eric was standing in the middle of a small dirt-floor room, staring at the far wall. His back was to me, and for a moment, relief washed over me. I stepped forward, calling his name, but he didn't respond. "Eric?" He didn't move. My flashlight beam followed his gaze, and that's when I saw what he was looking at. Carved into the dirt wall was a door. Not a real door, but an outline crudely scratched into the earth, and around it those same strange symbols from the cabin walls. "Eric, let's get out of here," I said, my voice cracking. But Eric didn't answer. He just kept staring, frozen, like he was in a trance. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "It's open." Suddenly the trapdoor above slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I yelled for Megan, but the only sound was Eric's heavy breathing next to me. He turned slowly, and when the light hit his face, my stomach dropped. His eyes were blank, wide, and empty. "They're coming," he whispered. I bolted for the stairs, practically dragging Eric behind me. When we reached the top, I slammed into the trapdoor, pushing it open with all my strength. Megan was on the other side, screaming, her face pale as death. We didn't stop running until we reached the clearing where our tents were. Eric barely spoke for the rest of the night, his face slack and pale. We packed up and left at first light. On the drive home, no one said a word. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped that place. Not really. Because ever since that night, I've been dreaming of that cabin, and in every dream, that carved door is waiting. And each time it's opened just a little bit wider. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to unplug, get some fresh air, and finally experience the stars without the light pollution of the city. My buddy Jake and I had planned it for weeks, scouring Google Maps for the most secluded spot we could find. We finally settled on a stretch of forest about 3 hours north of the city, a place no one seemed to know or care about. It was perfect, just trees, a lake, and silence. We left Friday afternoon, the car packed with gear and food. The further we drove, the narrower the road got, until eventually we were on nothing but a dirt trail, bumping along through the trees. There was no cell service by the time we reached the edge of the lake, just an expanse of dark water surrounded by dense, towering pines. It was quiet, eerily quiet. But that's what we wanted, right? I remember the sun was setting by the time we set up camp. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, the kind of color you only see in the wilderness. The lake looked black, completely still, like a mirror reflecting the trees that crowded its shores. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to seem paranoid. Besides, it was just a lake. Jake lit a fire, and soon the crackling of the flames filled the air, driving off some of the oppressive silence. We talked for a while, cracking open a couple of beers and joking about how this was the perfect spot for a horror movie. Neither of us knew how right we were. It started small, a rustling in the woods just beyond our campsite. It was subtle at first, like the wind brushing against the leaves, but there was no wind. The night was still. I glanced at Jake, but he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was pretending not to. He was always the type to brush off weird things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching. When the rustling got louder, I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. Jake shrugged. "Probably just a deer or something. Relax, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. Nothing out here but animals." But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. Closer now. "Yeah, maybe," I said, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I stared into the darkness, the firelight flickering and throwing shadows against the trees. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the gloom. My breath caught in my throat. "Jake," I whispered, gripping his arm. "Look." He turned, following my gaze, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "What the hell, man?" Jake said, frowning at me. "You're seeing things." But I knew what I saw. Someone was out there. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat gathering on my forehead despite the cool night air. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice shook. Yeah, you're probably right." But I didn't believe it. As the night dragged on, the forest around us seemed to come alive with sounds. Scratching, shifting, low, almost inaudible murmurs carried on the wind. Or maybe it wasn't the wind at all. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I expected to see the figure again, standing there, watching us. But it didn't reappear. Not yet. Jake eventually climbed into the tent and passed out. But I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, listening to the woods, straining to catch every sound. My mind was racing, half expecting to see that figure again, half wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. Hours passed, and the fire started to die down, the glowing embers barely giving off enough light to hold back the darkness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not in the distance this time, but close, right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the empty, silent woods. My breath was coming in ragged gasps now, and my hands were trembling. I reached for the flashlight, turning it on and sweeping the beam across the campsite, across the trees. Nothing. I turned back toward the fire, ready to tell myself I was being paranoid again. But then I froze. The tent. The flap was open, and Jake was gone. "Jake?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. I scrambled to my feet, shining the flashlight into the tent. His sleeping bag was there, unzipped and empty. Panic surged through me. Where the hell had he gone? "Jake?" I shouted this time, my voice cracking. Nothing but the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me from the trees. The woods were so dark now, the fire almost out completely. I shone the flashlight around, desperately searching for any sign of him, but it was like he had just vanished. And then I heard the breathing. It was soft at first, barely audible over the thudding of my heart. But it was there, heavy, labored, coming from somewhere just beyond the fire's light. My pulse quickened, my body tensing. "Jake?" I called again, though I knew it wasn't him. The breathing grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. A shadow. Not Jake, not human. Something tall, its shape barely visible at the edge of the trees, watching me. Its breath rasped in the cold air, slow and deliberate. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't alone. More shapes emerged from the shadows surrounding me, their forms indistinct but wrong. Bent, twisted. I backed toward the tent, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do, no clue what they were. Then, without warning, the closest one moved. It lunged forward faster than I thought possible, and before I could react, it was on me. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering away into the darkness. For a moment, everything was a blur of shadows and cold hands, pulling, dragging. I screamed for Jake, but my voice was swallowed by the night. I was pulled toward the woods, my legs kicking, fingers clawing at the earth, and then the thing stopped. I blinked, gasping for breath, and looked up. The figures had stepped back, melting into the darkness as if giving me a chance. The fire flared for a brief second, and that's when I saw him. Jake. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, eyes wide and vacant. He wasn't moving. "Jake!" I called, scrambling to my feet. But he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me, his mouth slightly open like he wanted to speak but couldn't. And then slowly, his lips curled into a smile, a wide, unnatural grin that split his face from ear to ear. "Come on, man," Jake's voice finally came, soft and broken. "It's your turn." That's when I realized the horrifying truth. Jake wasn't Jake anymore, and whatever had taken him was coming for me next. I've always loved the idea of camping in the wild, being out there away from everything where you can breathe and just exist. That's what made me jump at the chance when my friend Marcus suggested a weekend trip deep in the Smoky Mountains. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. We left early on a Friday, 4 of us crammed into Marcus's SUV, loaded with gear and high spirits. Along with Marcus, there was Jess, who always had the best ghost stories, and Ethan, our comic relief, the guy who could turn any tense situation into a joke. And then there was me, just hoping for some peace and quiet away from the buzz of life. The drive up the mountain took longer than expected. Roads twisted and turned, narrowing into rough, unmarked trails. The further we got, the fewer signs of civilization there were. Cell signals faded into nothing, and soon it was just us surrounded by endless stretches of dense trees, tall and dark like silent sentinels. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally over the forest floor. The campsite itself was nothing more than a small clearing, barely big enough for our 2 tents. It was hemmed in by a thick wall of trees that felt too close. The air was cooler here, the kind that presses against your skin like a warning. But Marcus was unfazed. "This is the spot," he said, grinning. "No one will find us here." We set up camp as the last of the light disappeared. Jess and I gathered firewood while Marcus and Ethan wrestled with the tents. The quiet was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. A silence so deep it swallowed everything. That night around the fire, the mood shifted. The usual banter was subdued. The crackling of the flames sounded louder than it should have, each snap echoing through the trees like it was the only sound for miles. Jess broke the silence, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you guys feel like we're being watched?" Ethan snorted. Classic Jess, can't resist creeping us out. But no one laughed. Even Marcus's smile faltered. "I'm serious," she continued, staring into the dark woods just beyond the glow of the fire. "There's something out there." I followed her gaze, but all I saw were trees, endless and impenetrable. But the more I stared, the more wrong they seemed. Their shapes didn't line up. Branches seemed to shift. Shadows flickered where there was no light. I felt a cold dread slither down my spine, something primal whispering that we weren't alone. The first incident happened that night. I woke up to the sound of rustling, soft at first, like something dragging through the underbrush. I lay still, my ears straining to hear. Then it grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of that. I nudged Marcus, who was snoring beside me in the tent. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He grunted, but didn't wake. The noise outside was getting closer. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, peeking out into the darkness. The fire had long since died, leaving everything pitch black. But the sound, it was right there, just beyond the trees. Something big was moving. My heart raced. Then, silence. I stared into the black void, half expecting something to leap out at me, but there was nothing. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my skin prickling, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. The next morning, Ethan was gone. At first, we thought he was just messing with us, typical Ethan, we figured. But after an hour of calling his name, trekking through the woods, we realized something was very, very wrong. His backpack was still there, his boots too. He wouldn't have gone far without them. Maybe he's playing some kind of prank, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes kept darting to the trees. By noon, panic had set in. Jess was near tears, pacing around the campsite, her eyes wide, darting around like she expected Ethan to jump out at any moment. But I knew better. Something had happened. The woods felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating, like we were trespassers in a place we didn't belong. And whatever owned this place, it didn't want us here. By dusk, we heard it again. The same rustling, circling us, moving through the underbrush. But this time it was faster, more agitated. I could see Marcus gripping his knife, his knuckles white. Jess refused to leave the fire, her face pale and drawn. Then, out of nowhere, Marcus stood up. "We have to find him," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't just—" He never finished his sentence. A blur shot out from the trees, something dark and impossibly fast, and Marcus was gone. One moment he was there, and the next the spot where he'd stood was empty, save for the knife he'd dropped. We didn't sleep that night. Jess and I sat with our backs to the fire, gripping the hatchet, our eyes scanning the woods, every crack of a branch sending us into a panic. But nothing came. Nothing except that creeping sense that something was watching, waiting. Morning came, but it didn't bring safety. Jess was the next to vanish. One minute she was gathering wood for the fire, and the next her scream tore through the forest. I ran toward the sound, but when I got there, the ground was disturbed, her footprints trailing into the trees, and then nothing. Just silence. I was alone. That was when I noticed something I hadn't before. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches or disturbed leaves. It was as if Jess had simply walked into the forest and disappeared, like Marcus, like Ethan. That's when it hit me. I knew this place. It wasn't the first time I'd been here. Memories came flooding back, fragmented and buried deep. I had been here before, years ago, and the people with me then, they'd vanished too. Just like this, because they weren't taken by something in the woods. They were taken by the woods. I'm not sure why I'm the one who always survives, why the woods let me go when they take the others. But it happens every time. I lure them here, unknowingly, until they're swallowed up, and I'm left alone, waiting for the next group of friends who want to escape into the wilderness. Because this place, it's not just alive, it's hungry, and now I'm already thinking about who I can bring next. Camping has always been my way of reconnecting with nature, a way to escape the demands of modern life. This time, though, I decided to go somewhere more remote, more isolated than ever before. A hidden gem deep in the heart of an old-growth forest, a place almost entirely untouched by humans. My friend Mark told me about it. He had been once, years ago, but warned me it wasn't for the faint-hearted. "There's something about that place, man," he said before I left. "The woods are different there. Just stay alert." I brushed off his cryptic warning, thinking it was his way of adding some thrill to my trip. I'd camped alone before. I could handle a few spooky stories. So, with my gear packed and my map marked, I drove the 2 hours to the drop-off point and started the hike into the wilderness. The trail was rugged, overgrown in spots like it hadn't been used in years. The forest itself felt dense, older than any I'd been in before. Towering trees blocked out much of the sunlight, and the deeper I went, the quieter everything became. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence of nature, though. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By late afternoon, I found a suitable clearing to set up camp, a small patch of flat ground surrounded by massive ancient pines. The air was cooler here, the light dim, even though the sun was still up. I built a fire, pitched my tent, and settled in for what I expected to be a calm night under the stars. That calm didn't last long. It started with a sound, barely perceptible at first, like the crack of a branch or the shuffle of leaves. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was thick and visibility was limited, but I figured it was just an animal passing through. Still, I kept glancing around, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire's glow was a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I chalked it up to nerves. First night jitters, I told myself. I'd be fine by morning. But then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. I scanned the trees, the underbrush, the ground, but the forest was empty. Still, the sound persisted. Soft, shuffling footsteps, always staying just out of sight. A chill crawled down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing eerily through the still night. No response. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, thick and suffocating. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight, every sense on high alert. But nothing happened. No more sounds, no movement. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I crawled back into my tent, though I didn't sleep easily. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside the tent. This time, it was right next to me. Something moving, brushing against the fabric. My heart was in my throat as I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow around the campsite. But in the half-light, I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. Tall, human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, like it didn't know how to stand properly. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing, but then it moved. Slowly, unnervingly, it bent forward as if trying to peer into the tent. I slammed the zipper shut and scrambled to the back of the tent, heart hammering so loudly I thought it would burst. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there clutching my knife, listening for any sound of movement outside, but there was only silence. That same oppressive, unnatural silence. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if it was still out there. I unzipped the tent just a crack and shined the flashlight through. The figure was gone. I bolted out of the tent, flashlight in hand, spinning in circles, scanning the perimeter. Nothing, no sign of it. My campsite looked completely undisturbed. But I knew what I saw. My mind wasn't playing tricks on me. I wasn't that tired. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire going, every muscle in my body tense, ready for whatever was lurking in the shadows. As dawn broke, I started packing up. There was no way I was staying another night. I wasn't even sure I could make it back the same way I came, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. As I was breaking camp, I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent, there were no footprints, no sign of anything having been there, but that didn't make sense. I had heard it, seen it. It had been so close. Then I saw the tree. One of the massive pines at the edge of the clearing had deep, jagged scratches carved into the bark, like something had dragged its nails or claws along the trunk. The markings were fresh. My blood ran cold. Whatever it was, it had been real. I grabbed my gear and set off, keeping my pace fast, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest seemed even quieter now, like it was watching me leave. After what felt like hours of hiking, I reached the trailhead, my car still parked where I'd left it. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. Back at home, I told Mark what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, his face went pale. "I didn't want to scare you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the reason I never went back there was because of the same thing. The figure. I thought I was imagining it, that maybe I'd been too tired or freaked myself out. But now..." His voice trailed off, and he didn't need to finish the sentence. "I haven't been camping since. I don't think I ever will again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and the world is quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of footsteps just outside my window, circling, waiting." I should have known better than to go camping alone. It had been years since I'd gone out into the woods. Work had consumed most of my life, and what little free time I had was spent in front of a screen. So when the idea struck me, driving out to the middle of nowhere, setting up camp and just disconnecting, it felt right. The drive took me 6 hours north, into the heart of the dense, secluded wilderness. I left my phone in the car, not because I wanted to, but because there was no signal this far out. It was just me, the thick expanse of trees and the cool biting wind that seemed to whisper secrets between the leaves. No distractions, no stress, just peace. At least, that was the plan. I found a clearing deep in the forest, far from any trails. Perfect. The sun was dipping low by the time I got the tent set up, painting the trees with hues of deep orange and purple. The forest was alive with sounds: crickets, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional distant hoot of an owl. All the familiar, comforting noises of nature. For the first time in months, I felt at ease. As darkness fell, I started a fire. I sat there just watching the flames lick at the cool night air, listening to the wood crackle and pop. The world around me seemed to quiet down with the fall of night. A deep silence settled over the woods. It wasn't unsettling, not yet. It was just still. A twig snapped. I flinched, my head snapping towards the sound. But there was nothing. Just the dark stretch of forest beyond the reach of the firelight. I laughed at myself. Too much city living had made me jumpy. It wasn't until later, as I was lying in the tent trying to sleep, that the real unease began to creep in. You ever have that feeling when you know someone's watching you? I felt it then, that thick, unsettling pressure at the back of your neck. My heart started to race, pounding in my chest. The wind outside had died down, and the crickets had fallen silent. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening. Every small sound felt amplified: the rustling of the nylon fabric, the faint creak of a tree branch somewhere in the distance, and then unmistakable footsteps. Not the soft padding of an animal, not the skittering of a squirrel, or the crackle of leaves from the wind. These were slow, deliberate footsteps. Heavy. Close. They circled the tent. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I was sure whoever or whatever it was could hear it. I wanted to move, but I felt frozen, trapped. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the tent, right by my head. I could hear shallow, uneven breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was some stupid prank, maybe another camper messing with me. But deep down, I knew I was alone out here. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slowly, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night wide-eyed, clutching the knife I'd packed, staring at the thin walls of the tent as if they'd offer me any protection. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, I scrambled out of the tent. The fire had long since gone out, leaving nothing but cold ashes. But that wasn't what froze me in place. Around the camp, in the dirt, were footprints. Bare, human footprints, circling the tent, wandering off into the woods. I hadn't imagined it. I packed up as fast as I could. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind sent a jolt of panic through me. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from between the trees. It wasn't until I was halfway back to my car that I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were ahead of me. I froze, my body drenched in cold sweat. Slowly, I scanned the path, and that's when I saw him, standing maybe 50 feet away, barely visible through the trees. A man. His skin was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His hair was matted and long, hanging in greasy clumps around his face. But what struck me most were his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and they were locked onto mine. I couldn't move. He didn't either. We just stood there, staring at each other through the trees. Then, without a word, he turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the woods. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, to keep walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint. I didn't want to follow him, but he was heading in the same direction I was, back towards my car. When I reached the parking area, it was empty. My car was the only one there, exactly as I'd left it. Relief washed over me as I fumbled with the keys, threw my gear in the trunk, and slammed the door shut. I didn't even bother buckling my seatbelt before I turned the ignition and peeled out of there. I must have driven for hours before I finally pulled over to catch my breath. I was shaking, my mind racing with what I'd seen. Who was he? What did he want? Why had he been watching me? Then I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, sitting in the back seat, staring at me with those same wide, unblinking eyes, was myself. But not me. A twisted version of me. Pale, gaunt, hollow, grinning. Eyes black as night. "I never left," it whispered. "You just forgot." And that's when I remembered. I never liked the idea of camping alone. The isolation of it, the vulnerability of being surrounded by miles of forest and no one to call for help. But when Lily left me, after 3 years together, I just needed to get away, to clear my head, to be somewhere that the chaos of city life couldn't touch me. So, I found a remote spot online, deep in the northern wilderness, miles from any main road. It sounded perfect. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky bruised with dusk, the air cool with the approaching night. The pine trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their thick trunks twisting high above, casting long shadows across the mossy ground. There was no sound but the occasional whisper of wind weaving through the branches, a soft rustling like distant whispers. Setting up camp was quick. Tent staked, fire started, and everything arranged. I sat there, staring into the flames, watching the wood crackle and pop, the orange light flickering across the clearing. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The sun had long disappeared, the fire now the only light around me, throwing shadows across the trees. I should have felt relaxed. I should have enjoyed the solitude. But instead, a strange sense of unease crept in. The woods felt too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, stifling kind, like the world was holding its breath. No birds, no crickets, just stillness. I shook it off. Just being paranoid, I muttered to myself, staring into the dancing flames. The loneliness was getting to me. A crack sounded from the tree line behind me, a branch snapping. I turned, heart jumping, flashlight in hand. I swept the beam across the trees, eyes straining to catch movement. Nothing, just dense forest, thick with shadows. I told myself it was a deer or some other harmless animal, but my gut tightened. It felt wrong. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, returning to the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I heard it, faint, barely audible. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but no. It was clearer than that, like someone speaking softly, just on the edge of my hearing. I stood up, my skin prickling. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. The whisper stopped. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight again. Nothing moved, no signs of life, just my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to sit back down, focusing on the warmth of the fire, the crackling of the wood. Maybe I was hearing things, or maybe the isolation was just messing with me. The mind does strange things when it's left to wander, right? But then, a few minutes later, the whispering started again. This time it was closer. I stood turning in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from beyond the trees, just out of sight. A low, murmuring sound like someone talking to themselves. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the hammering in my chest, and called out again. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the faint, unintelligible whispering. I should have packed up right then and there, hiked back to my car, and gotten the hell out of those woods. But I didn't. Stubborn, maybe. Or maybe too curious for my own good. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped into the trees. The light barely cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I walked slowly, carefully, the whispering growing louder the deeper I went. My heart pounded in my ears, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I had to know what it was, like it was pulling me in. And then suddenly the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I swung the flashlight around, desperate to see what was lurking just out of sight, but the beam only illuminated the twisted trunks of trees and the dense undergrowth. I turned to head back to the camp when I saw it, a shape. At first I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the light, but then it moved. My breath caught in my throat as I pointed the flashlight toward it. Standing between two trees was a figure. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its body was too thin, too tall. Its limbs long and gaunt, like it had been stretched out. Its face. God, its face was the worst. Pale, expressionless, with hollow eyes that stared right at me, unblinking. Its mouth hung open, as if frozen mid-whisper. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. The flashlight rolled from my hand, casting erratic beams of light across the forest floor. I scrambled to grab it, but when I pointed it back at the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. I bolted to my feet and ran, crashing through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I didn't stop until I was back at the campsite, chest heaving, sweat chilling my skin. I stood there panting, listening. The whispering had stopped, but the woods felt heavier now, like the trees were closing in, watching me. My gut screamed at me to leave, to pack up and run, but something kept me rooted in place. Then I saw it, just at the edge of the firelight, standing between the pines. That same figure, but this time there were more of them, 5, maybe 6, all standing in a loose circle around the clearing, their pale faces barely visible in the flickering firelight, mouths hanging open, whispering. I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking, cold. I backed toward the tent, my hands shaking, eyes darting from one figure to the next. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, as if responding to my fear, the whispering grew louder, clearer. I finally understood what they were saying. They were calling my name. How could they know my name? I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Suddenly, the fire died out, plunging the clearing into darkness. And that's when I felt it, cold, bony fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I turned to run, but it was too late. I was no longer alone in the woods. I had never been alone. And now I was theirs. I always thought solo camping was my sanctuary. No distractions, no people, just me and nature. It's the only time I felt truly disconnected from the chaos of daily life. So when I found a map of unmarked campsites deep within the Smoky Mountains, I was eager to explore. The trail was rough, overgrown, and hardly used, but that's what I liked about it. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I set up camp quickly, a small tent, a fire pit, and a little space to stretch out under the stars. The forest around me was dense, with ancient trees that seemed to tower forever, their leaves creating a thick canopy that made it feel much later than it was. I sat by the fire as twilight deepened into night, the flames casting long shadows over the clearing. It was quiet, eerily so. No crickets, no wind, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. The firelight flickered, dancing off the trees. I leaned back, letting myself sink into the solitude, the peaceful silence of the forest. But then I noticed something strange. Far off in the distance, through the thick trees, there was a light. A small flickering glow. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, or maybe some sort of reflection from my fire. But it didn't move like that. It was soft, pale, and steady, like an old lantern swaying gently in the breeze. The rational part of my brain told me it was another camper, though it didn't make much sense. The trail was practically non-existent, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. But as the light continued to hover just beyond the trees, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, cautiously walking toward the glow. The air felt heavier as I moved deeper into the woods, the underbrush crunching under my boots. My fire faded behind me, its warm glow swallowed by the shadows. I kept my eyes fixed on the light, weaving through the thick trunks, stepping over fallen logs and rocks. It stayed just far enough away that I couldn't make out who or what was carrying it. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and there it was, the lantern, swaying gently from a low-hanging branch of an oak tree. The light was dim, casting an unnatural pale glow that barely illuminated the ground beneath it. The glass was fogged, cracked in places, and the metal frame was rusted and old, like it hadn't been touched in years. I approached it cautiously, shining my flashlight around the area. There was no one there. No campsite, no trail, nothing. Just the lantern, hanging silently. I reached out to touch it, feeling a cold chill seep into my skin as I got closer. But before my fingers could brush against the glass, the light flickered, and then went out. Darkness. I stood there frozen, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight flickered for a second, the beam cutting in and out, and in that brief moment, I saw something, just for a split second, standing in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure tall and thin with wide, hollow eyes staring right at me. The flashlight sputtered back to life, and the figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I spun around, shining the light frantically in every direction, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sound, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I didn't wait to see what else might happen. I bolted back through the trees, tripping over roots and rocks as I rushed toward my campsite. The light from my fire was a distant, welcoming beacon, and I practically threw myself into the clearing, gasping for breath. I stood there panting, my eyes darting around the edge of the forest. For a long time, nothing happened. The fire crackled softly, the air still. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. Maybe it was some old abandoned lantern from another camper, and I let my imagination run wild. But as I sat down by the fire trying to calm my nerves, I realized something was wrong. The air felt different, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. Lanterns. Dozens of them. They were hanging from the trees all around my campsite, each one glowing with that same pale, cold light. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I stood slowly, feeling my heart race as I backed toward my tent. The light swayed gently, as if in sync with some invisible breeze, but the air around me was completely still. My hand shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to get a signal, but of course there was none. Not out here. I glanced at the forest again, and that's when I saw them. The figures. At first they were barely visible, just dark shapes moving between the trees, slipping in and out of the shadows. But as the lantern swayed, I saw them more clearly. Tall, thin figures with hollow eyes, their faces gaunt and pale, watching me from the edge of the clearing. There were dozens of them, just like the lanterns, their eyes locked on me, unmoving. I backed away, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. One of the figures stepped closer, its face coming into the light. It looked human, but wrong, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. It raised one hand slowly, pointing at me. I didn't wait. I grabbed my backpack, left the tent behind, and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from those things. The lanterns, the figures. They watched me as I stumbled through the trees, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. I ran for what felt like hours, crashing through the underbrush, my lungs burning, until finally I reached the road where I had parked. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off, not daring to look back. I've tried to forget that night, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those lanterns swaying in the trees, and those figures, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still see a pale light flickering through the trees outside my window. A lantern. I've always loved camping. Growing up, my dad used to take me out to the woods every summer, and we'd spend the weekend fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. So, when a few buddies invited me out for a weekend camping trip in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a guys' trip, a reunion of sorts since we hadn't all been together in years. There were 4 of us, me, Dave, Matt, and Lucas. We picked a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any towns or cell reception. The perfect place to disconnect. When we arrived, the site was everything you'd want in a remote camping spot. Dense trees, a small clearing for our tents, and a stream nearby for water. But as soon as we set up camp, something felt off. At first, it was small things. The air felt heavier than it should. The wind carried strange, almost rhythmic sounds, and the woods around us seemed too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves that felt too purposeful to be random. We all noticed it but brushed it off. It was probably just our minds playing tricks on us, we told ourselves. Still, by the time night fell and we were sitting around the fire, drinking and swapping stories, there was an undercurrent of unease none of us could shake. That's when we heard it, a distant low wail. It was faint, like a moan carried on the wind, but it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I looked at the others, and they'd heard it too. Dave, always the skeptic, waved it off as some animal. Mountain lions or some shit, he said with a shrug, though even he didn't sound convinced. But it wasn't just once. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. A long, drawn-out wail that echoed through the trees. We all fell silent, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded human. Lucas, the most experienced hiker among us, stood up and grabbed his flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he said, pointing it toward the direction of the sound. Matt and I looked at each other, hesitant. "Man, are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked. But Lucas was already heading into the woods. We watched his light bob through the trees until it disappeared completely. The minutes dragged on. 5 minutes. 10. The wailing stopped, and now we were sitting in complete silence. The longer he was gone, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, the wailing returned, this time louder, as if it were right outside the camp. But something was different. It wasn't just a cry. There was a strange, mocking tone to it, like it was imitating the sound rather than making it. Suddenly, Lucas's light appeared again in the distance. We breathed a sigh of relief as he stumbled back into camp, looking pale and shaken. "You find anything?" Dave asked, but Lucas didn't respond. He just stared at us, his eyes wide, his face drawn. "Lucas," Matt tried, his voice low and uncertain. And then Lucas smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. Something about it was wrong, horribly wrong. The firelight flickered across his features, casting strange shadows, and for a split second it looked like his face was shifting, as if his features weren't entirely fixed. "Where did you go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Lucas, or whatever was standing there, tilted his head, still grinning, and said in a voice that wasn't his, "I never left." The chill that ran through me was like ice water down my spine. That wasn't Lucas's voice. It was too deep, too distorted, like someone was trying to mimic him but couldn't quite get it right. I stood up, backing away slowly. What the hell is going on? "Sit down, man," Dave said, his voice cracking. "Stop messing around, Lucas." But Lucas, or whatever was wearing his face, just kept smiling. Then he turned and walked toward the edge of the woods, back into the darkness without another word. We didn't follow. We didn't dare. Dave tried to rationalize it. Maybe Lucas was just messing with us. Maybe he was playing some elaborate prank. But deep down, we all knew something was horribly wrong. An hour passed. Then 2. We sat around the fire, gripping our flashlights and knives, listening for any sign of movement. Every so often we'd hear that wail again, closer, further, circling us like something was toying with us. Eventually we couldn't take it anymore. "We need to get out of here," Matt said, his voice shaking. We packed up in a rush, barely bothering to roll up the tents, and started heading toward the trailhead. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more lost we felt. None of the landmarks looked familiar. It was like the forest had shifted, rearranged itself to confuse us. As the hours dragged on, panic set in. It felt like we were walking in circles, but every time we tried to turn back, we'd end up somewhere else, deeper into the woods, further from any hope of escape. That's when we saw it. Standing at the edge of our flashlight beams was Lucas, or at least it looked like him. But his face was wrong. The skin hung loose like it didn't quite fit. His eyes were too wide, too dark. And that smile. God, that smile. He spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was that same distorted, mocking tone from earlier. "I told you, I never left." Before any of us could react, he or it vanished into the trees again, swallowed by the darkness. We ran. We didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, and even then, it took us hours to find the trailhead. We never found Lucas. Days later, search teams combed the area, but they didn't find a trace of him either. The official story was that he got lost, that maybe he fell or was taken by a predator. But we knew the truth. Or at least we thought we did. Sometimes late at night I hear that wail again. Faint, just at the edge of my hearing, like it's calling to me. And when I do, I think about Lucas. I think about whatever it was that came back in his place. I've always enjoyed camping, but I usually go with friends. This time I decided to challenge myself and go solo. It wasn't something I thought too much about. Just me, my gear, and a few days in the wilderness to clear my head. I found a place I'd never been before, a remote area known as Deadwood Ridge. It wasn't exactly popular, which was perfect for someone wanting to get away from the world for a while. The hike in was peaceful enough. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places, but I'd expected that. The deeper I went into the forest, the older it felt. The trees were massive, gnarled things, their bark dark and cracked, covered in moss. And the silence, well, I'd been in quiet woods before, but this was different. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just stillness. I shrugged it off. Sometimes forests were like that, especially in the fall. Maybe the animals were further out, away from where I was heading. Either way, I didn't let it bother me. I set up camp near a small stream about a mile off the trail. The sun was setting, casting a faint golden light through the trees. It would have been beautiful, if not for that strange feeling of isolation that crept up on me. As the night fell, I built a small fire, sat down with my food, and enjoyed the quiet. The stars were out, faintly visible through the thick canopy of leaves above. I felt a little on edge, but that was natural when you're alone, right? I figured I'd settle down once I got used to the stillness. A few hours passed and the fire burned low. That's when I heard it. A faint sound in the distance. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible. A rustling, like someone, or something, moving through the trees. I paused, listening carefully. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal coming closer to the stream for water. I tried to convince myself that's all it was. But then I realized it wasn't just rustling. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming toward me. I stood up, my heart racing, shining my flashlight into the trees. "Hello?" I called, though the word felt weak in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet again. The only sound was the crackling of the dying fire. I stood there, my flashlight beam sweeping across the dense trees, catching nothing but shadows. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. The forest was playing tricks on me, I reasoned. That kind of thing happens when you're alone for too long. So I settled back down by the fire and let it burn out, retreating to my tent. But the unease didn't go away. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the strange feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just the solitude, an overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. My eyes were just starting to close when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer, much closer. They circled the tent slowly, as if whoever or whatever was outside was deliberately taking its time. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, every instinct in my body screaming for me to stay still, to not make a sound. The footsteps stopped directly outside the entrance to my tent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack, clutching it tightly, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. Then, without warning, the tent shifted. Someone was pressing against it from the outside, running their hand along the fabric, tracing slow circles. My mouth went dry as I watched the shape move, pressing against the thin layer of nylon between me and whoever or whatever was out there. I held my breath, waiting, hoping it would go away. But then the zipper on my tent began to slide open, slowly, agonizingly slow. I couldn't move, frozen in terror as the zipper inched its way down. The flap opened slightly, and I was staring into the pitch-black night outside. For a long moment, nothing happened. There was only silence and the open tent flap. Then I saw it, a face, pale, almost gray, with eyes that were wide and staring, unblinking. It was just there, peering into the tent, watching me. The eyes were empty, vacant, but somehow filled with an unnatural intent. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I lunged forward, shoving the flap closed, yanking the zipper up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get it to seal. The moment I did, I heard the footsteps again, faster this time, retreating into the woods. I sat there in the dark, clutching my knife, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. It had to be a hallucination. Maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. But the face, the eyes, those were real. They were burned into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches made my heart race. I waited for the footsteps to return, but they didn't. Eventually, dawn broke, casting a pale light over the forest. The mist that had clung to the ground all night was still thick, swirling lazily around the trees. I packed up my camp as fast as I could, throwing everything into my pack without bothering to organize it. I just wanted to leave, to get out of that place. As I started back toward the trail, I felt it again, that sense of being watched. Halfway through the hike, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the mud just off the trail were footprints, bare human footprints. They weren't mine. They were smaller, more delicate, like a woman's, and they weren't fresh. They were old, partially filled in by rain, but still visible. They led off the trail and into the woods, disappearing into the mist. I didn't stop to investigate. I didn't care to know where they led or who or what had made them. I just kept walking, faster, not stopping until I reached my car and sped away from Deadwood Ridge. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that forest. Sometimes at night, I hear footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate. But when I look, there's no one there, just a faint mist swirling in the air. I've always preferred camping alone. Something about the isolation, the quiet, the freedom to move at my own pace, always felt like the purest way to experience the wilderness. No distractions, just me and nature. It was supposed to be peaceful. This time, though, it wasn't. I had planned a solo camping trip deep into the Rockies. The spot I'd chosen was miles away from the nearest trailhead, a small secluded clearing beside a river. I'd been there once before, years ago, and remembered it being a perfect escape. No cell service, no hikers, no people, just me and the forest. That's exactly what I needed. The hike in was long but uneventful. The sun was setting as I reached the clearing, casting an orange glow over the trees and the rushing water. I set up camp quickly, eager to settle in for the night. My fire crackled as the darkness fell around me, the woods alive with the usual sounds. Crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, the gurgle of the river. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was subtle at first, just a feeling really. Like the air was heavier, or the night was darker than usual. I chalked it up to being alone. After all, the mind plays tricks when you're isolated. But as the hours went by, the unease grew. It started with the shadows. I was sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal, when I noticed them. At first, I thought it was just the flickering flames casting strange shapes on the trees, but something about the way the shadows moved caught my attention. They didn't seem to match the rhythm of the fire. They shifted, danced, but not with the wind. They seemed deliberate. I stared at them for a while, convinced my mind was playing tricks, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became. The shadows were moving. Slowly, yes, but with purpose. I couldn't see what was casting them, only that they were there and they were getting closer. I forced myself to look away. It was late, I was tired, and the isolation was messing with my head. That's all it was. I threw another log on the fire and turned my back to the shadows, focusing on the warmth of the flames, the comfort of routine. But the feeling didn't go away. That creeping sensation of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the light. I told myself to sleep. The fire was enough to keep anything at bay, if there was anything at all. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, listening to the crackling fire and the steady rush of the river. It wasn't long before I heard something else. Footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Slow, cautious steps, like someone or something was creeping around my campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I lay there, frozen, listening. The steps were deliberate, moving in a slow circle just outside the firelight. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded human. I gripped the knife I kept beside me, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right by the edge of my tent. I could hear breathing now, low, shallow breaths like someone was standing just inches away from the fabric, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to jump up, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing. The breathing grew louder, more deliberate. It felt like an eternity lying there, listening to whatever was outside my tent, waiting for it to make a move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps resumed, slow and steady, retreating back toward the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, clutching my knife, my ears straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the crackling fire and the river. I waited until the first light of dawn before daring to step outside. The campsite looked normal, no signs of anyone or anything around. The fire had burned down to embers, the river still flowed peacefully. But the air was thick with that same unease, that feeling that something was wrong. Then I saw it. Just outside the clearing, right where the shadows had been moving the night before, I found them. Footprints. Human footprints. Bare, like someone had been walking without shoes. They circled my campsite just as I had heard, stopping right where my tent had been. My blood ran cold. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my pack without caring if it was organized. I didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. As I moved to leave, something caught my eye, a small object hanging from a tree at the edge of the clearing. It was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like strips of cloth. Old, tattered cloth, stained dark. It swung gently in the breeze, like some kind of twisted ornament. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know what it meant. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I didn't stop, didn't look back, until I was safely in my car, miles away from that clearing. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation getting the better of me. But those footprints, they were real. And sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear those same slow, deliberate footsteps outside my window. I've always loved the outdoors, being away from the noise, the stress, the chaos of everyday life. Camping has been my way of reconnecting with nature and, frankly, with myself. So when the chance came for a solo trip deep into the mountains, I couldn't resist. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to clear my mind. But it ended up being the most terrifying experience of my life. The first 2 days were uneventful. The campsite was secluded, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. The air was crisp, with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. The spot was perfect, far from any trails or signs of other campers. Exactly what I needed. By the third night, though, I noticed something strange. I had set up my tent in a small clearing, a good distance from a quiet river. The trees were dense, making it feel like I was cut off from the world. That evening, I sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. But then I heard it, branches snapping like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I stood up, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a deer or some other animal, I thought. Still, it felt off. Animals usually avoided humans, especially ones that made as much noise as I did. But whatever was out there wasn't shy. The footsteps came closer, crunching over leaves, deliberate and slow. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was just another hiker, maybe someone who had wandered too far. But there was no reply. Just the sound of those heavy, slow footsteps. I shined my flashlight into the woods, but the beam only revealed more trees, stretching endlessly into the dark. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The footsteps stopped, as if whoever, or whatever it was, knew I was looking. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just an animal after all, maybe a large one like a moose or a bear. So I went back to the fire, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods, once peaceful, now felt claustrophobic. Every creak of the trees and rustle of the wind sent my senses into overdrive. I barely slept that night, waking up at every sound. At one point, I swore I heard soft breathing just outside my tent. I sat up, heart racing, but when I unzipped the flap and peered out, there was only silence and darkness. The next day I was exhausted but determined to enjoy the trip. I decided to explore further down the river, hoping to shake off the weird vibes. The air was still, the forest unnervingly quiet, but I pressed on. That's when I found it. About half a mile from my campsite, tucked between two massive pines, was an old, tattered tent. It looked abandoned, its fabric torn and dirty, as if it had been out there for months, maybe years. I crouched down to inspect it. Inside were scattered belongings, moldy clothes, a rusted lantern, a notebook half buried in the dirt. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through the notebook. Most of the pages were damaged beyond recognition, but a few entries were still readable. They described someone's camping trip, much like mine. The last entry, though, was chilling. Something is watching me. I hear it every night, getting closer. I think it's trying to get inside my tent. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Was this a coincidence? Maybe, but it felt too close to what I'd experienced the night before. I quickly backed away from the tent, feeling exposed. The woods didn't feel serene anymore. They felt predatory. I decided to head back to my campsite and pack up. This trip was over. Whatever had happened here, I didn't want to be next. As I hurried back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but the sensation of eyes on me persisted. The woods seemed darker now, more sinister. When I finally reached my campsite, I froze. My tent was slashed open, torn apart like some wild animal had gotten to it. My gear was scattered, my food torn from the cooler. But it wasn't the destruction that terrified me. It was the footprints, human footprints, barefoot, leading from the tree line, circling my tent, and then disappearing back into the woods. Panic set in. I grabbed what I could, stuffed it into my pack, and bolted down the trail. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just needed to get out of there. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees as I ran. I kept hearing things, a twig snapping, a low rustle. But every time I looked back, the trail was empty. After what felt like hours of running, I finally reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I thought I'd left it all behind. I thought I was safe. But when I got home that night, I found dirt on my living room floor, and a single footprint by the window. I never camped alone again. It started out like any other camping trip. A few of us from work decided to escape the noise of the city and venture into the wilderness for a weekend. We were no strangers to the outdoors, but this time we wanted to push ourselves a bit further, deeper into a national park that had no designated campsites, the kind of place where the trail ends and you make your own way. There were 4 of us: Mike, Sarah, Jen, and me. We parked the car at a remote trailhead and hiked for about 5 hours to a clearing by a lake. The air was crisp, the trees towering above like sentinels guarding some long-forgotten secret. It was perfect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up camp and built a fire. The first night was calm, full of laughter and shared stories under the blanket of stars. It was everything we had hoped for, until the noises started. It was subtle at first, a rustling in the bushes, the sound of branches snapping in the distance. We all chalked it up to animals. Probably deer, Mike said, poking the fire with a stick. We were in their territory after all. But then came the whispers. At least that's what I thought they were. It was so faint I almost convinced myself it was the wind. But around 2 a.m., I woke up in my tent. Something felt off. I unzipped the flap and peered out. The fire had died down to embers, and everything was eerily still. Too still. Then I heard it. A low, guttural hum, almost like chanting, drifting through the trees. I froze, scanning the dark woods, straining my ears. The sound seemed to come from all around us, yet nowhere at once. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Jen's tent rustled as she sat up, her silhouette barely visible in the faint moonlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, though she probably couldn't see me. "Yeah, I thought it was..." A loud snap, like a tree branch being torn in half, echoed from the direction of the lake. We all shot up now, Mike grabbing the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it felt wrong. Like the light couldn't penetrate far enough, as if the woods were swallowing it. We were wide awake now, adrenaline spiking as more sounds followed. Shuffling feet, distant laughter, sharp and hollow like it didn't belong to anything human. We huddled together around the dying fire, weapons in hand. a hatchet, a knife, anything we could grab. Maybe it's other campers messing with us, Sarah offered, though she didn't sound convinced. Mike stood up, shining the flashlight toward the lake. We should check it out. If there are people out there screwing with us, we need to... Wait, Jen interrupted. Listen. The chanting had stopped. The silence was deafening. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then something splashed in the lake, hard, like something large had just been thrown into the water. Our heads snapped toward the sound. Mike aimed the flashlight, but the beam flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Before any of us could react, there was movement. Fast, too fast. Something large and heavy rushed through the underbrush, the snapping of branches coming toward us, toward the camp. We bolted. We didn't even think to grab our gear. All I remember is the frantic scramble through the trees, the wet leaves slipping underfoot as we ran blindly in the dark. The sound of whatever it was grew louder, almost deafening. I could feel its presence as if it was breathing down my neck. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead. Somehow we had made it back to the car. Out of breath and shaking, we piled in, Mike fumbling with the keys. We peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the gravel road. It wasn't until we were a few miles away that anyone spoke. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her knees to her chest. No one had an answer. We drove in silence, the only sound the rumble of the engine and our labored breathing. But then, as we rounded a bend in the road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the road. It was just a glimpse, a flash of white, pale against the dark forest. But it was enough. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't mention it to the others. I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. The next day we reported the incident to the park rangers. They said there shouldn't have been anyone else out there. The area was too remote, and they hadn't issued any permits for that region. They chalked it up to our nerves, maybe the isolation getting to us. But something wasn't right. After we got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked outside my apartment window, I felt eyes on me, just out of sight. 2 nights later, Mike was found dead. His body was discovered floating in a nearby lake. The official report said he drowned, but that didn't make sense. Mike was an experienced swimmer. He had grown up near the water. I went to his funeral, still haunted by the memory of that night. After the service, I approached Jen and Sarah. I needed to talk about it, to figure out what happened. But when I brought it up, they stared at me like I was insane. "What camping trip?" Sarah asked, eyes wide with confusion. My heart sank. I looked at Jen, expecting her to remember to back me up. She shook her head. "We haven't been camping in years." I left, shaking, heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I had seen. I knew what we had been through, but now, I'm not sure anymore. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear the chanting. I love camping, or at least I used to. There's something about being deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl, that always made me feel free. It's a way to escape the noise, the chaos, the demands of life. But that's what I thought before that night. Before I discovered that sometimes isolation isn't peaceful. It's terrifying. Last fall, I decided to camp solo for the first time. I'd done it with friends plenty of times, but I wanted to challenge myself, prove I could survive a weekend alone with just a tent, a fire, and the woods. I chose a remote site tucked miles away from the nearest town. No cell service, no people, just me and nature. That first day was perfect. I hiked, collected firewood, and watched the sun dip beneath the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I set up my tent just on the edge of a small clearing. The trees surrounding me were dense, their branches intertwined like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky. It was serene. But as the darkness settled in, I started to feel it, this thickness in the air, a weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was subtle at first. I brushed it off as paranoia, the mind playing tricks in the isolation. But as the night went on, that weight grew heavier. I sat by the fire staring into the flames when I first heard it, a soft rustling in the trees just beyond the light of the fire. At first I thought it might be a deer, maybe a raccoon. Normal forest sounds, right? But then the rustling stopped, and there was a silence, so complete that even the chirping crickets fell quiet. Then it started again, slow footsteps, deliberate, coming closer. My heart started to race as I strained to listen. I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps continued just beyond the tree line circling my camp. They were too heavy for a small animal, too quiet for something large like a bear. They were human, or at least I thought they were. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it into the trees. Nothing. The light caught only the trunks of the tall pines and the tangled underbrush, but the sound persisted, moving slowly, deliberately around the perimeter of my camp. I should have left right then, packed up my stuff and bolted, but I didn't. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind, my imagination. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, something damp, rotting, like wet earth mixed with decay. It drifted in on the breeze, wrapping around me, suffocating. My stomach churned and I had to fight the urge to gag. And then I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, just within the shadows, something moved. It was so quick, I almost thought I'd imagined it. A shape, a figure, ducking behind a tree. My pulse quickened as I aimed my flashlight again, the beam shaking in my trembling hands. There, a pale face peeking from behind the trunk just long enough for me to register its unnatural stillness. Its eyes, wide, hollow, and too dark, stared directly at me. The face didn't belong to any animal. It didn't even look human. It darted back into the darkness before I could react. I stood frozen, the flashlight beam dancing across the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but it couldn't. It was all wrong. Its features too gaunt, its movements too fast, too twisted. The footsteps picked up again, now faster, almost frantic, circling me in the darkness. And then the whispers started. Faint, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. They came from all directions, soft voices overlapping each other as if multiple people were murmuring just out of sight. I spun in place, the flashlight doing nothing to pierce the oppressive dark. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right beside me. "Stop! Stop!" I screamed, stepping back toward the fire, desperate for the warmth, the light, the safety. The whispers stopped, the footsteps stopped. Everything went completely silent again, and then I heard it, right behind me. A voice, clear and cold, whispering in my ear, "Run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag, ditched the tent, and bolted. I ran blindly into the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly, barely illuminating the narrow path ahead. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I stumbled through the underbrush, gasping for breath, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The footsteps followed, but now they weren't circling. They were chasing. I could hear them right behind me, closer with every step, and that smell. God, it was so much stronger now. The air was thick with it, choking me, making my eyes water as I sprinted through the forest. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. But somehow, I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally threw myself inside, locking the doors. For a moment I sat there, panting, staring into the trees, expecting to see something, someone, burst from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the woods. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the narrow dirt road, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds. As the distance between me and the campsite grew, the oppressive feeling started to lift. I almost let out a breath of relief. Almost. And then, as I turned onto the highway, I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. Something was sitting in my back seat. Pale face, wide dark eyes staring back at me. The whispers returned. I don't know why I thought camping alone would be a good idea. Maybe it was the allure of silence, the promise of disconnecting from the noise of the city, or just the challenge of pushing my limits. I've always been an outdoorsman, but never this deep in the woods, never this isolated. I found the campsite tucked away near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. It was miles from any trailhead. No cell service, no people for at least a day's hike in any direction. Perfect for the solitude I thought I needed. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and settled in. The stillness was unnerving at first, but eventually it became almost meditative. By nightfall, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, trying to shake the strange sensation that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation messing with my head. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt off. As the fire dwindled, I started hearing it, soft at first, almost like the wind rustling the trees, but different. It was a distant whisper, a murmur, just beyond the tree line. I paused, straining to listen, but it stopped as soon as I focused on it. Brushing it off, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, convincing myself it was nothing but the woods playing tricks on my mind. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I began to drift off, I'd hear the whisper again, closer, louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, and it was calling my name. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart racing, ears straining for any sound beyond the tent's thin walls. Silence. Complete and utter silence. But now I was wide awake, adrenaline coursing through me. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. The night was still. Too still. Not a single cricket chirped, no wind in the trees. The forest around me felt suffocating, like it was waiting for something. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease the oppressive feeling hanging over the campsite. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see what? An animal? A person? But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of woods. I decided to stoke the fire, adding more wood until the flames roared again. It brought some comfort, at least enough to convince me I was safe for the moment. But then I saw them. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There, just beyond the light of the fire, stood a figure. Pale, almost translucent. It was a woman, her face hidden in shadow. But I could see her outline, see her long, tattered dress blowing gently as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The whispering returned, louder now, insistent, circling me. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me. I blinked, and she was gone. I stumbled back into the tent, zipped it up, and grabbed the knife I'd brought. I held it in front of me, hand trembling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a hallucination from exhaustion or fear. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. The whispers continued, growing louder. Sometimes right next to my ear, other times fading into the distance. But they never stopped. Eventually, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The sunlight streaming through the tent brought a small measure of relief, but the dread hadn't left. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, eager to get out of those woods, to get back to civilization. As I hiked, though, something felt wrong. I couldn't quite place it, but the forest seemed different. The trees, they didn't look like they did the day before. The path I had taken in didn't seem familiar anymore. I was starting to panic, my breathing becoming shallow. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I picked up the pace. But when I broke through the trees, my heart dropped into my stomach. It was the same campsite, my campsite, the same fire pit, the same tent stakes still lodged in the ground. I had been walking in circles. Impossible. I knew I had been going in a straight line, following the map. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't made a mistake. That's when I heard it again. The whisper, clear as day now, coming from directly behind me. I spun around, and there she was, the same pale figure, standing no more than 10 feet away. But now I could see her face. Hollow eyes stared at me, her mouth moving slowly, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the ground beneath me was pulling me down, like invisible hands were gripping my ankles. Suddenly I was falling, the earth giving way beneath me, plunging me into darkness. I woke up in my tent, heart hammering in my chest, the sunlight once again streaming in. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream, but my body ached. Dirt clung to my clothes, and the whispers were still there, faint, lingering at the edge of my hearing. I packed up and left, following the same path out of the woods. But when I finally emerged, I saw the sign. A faded, weathered wooden sign covered in moss, barely readable. Campsite closed, 1978, fatal accident, 2 campers missing, presumed dead. My blood ran cold. As I stood there, frozen, I glanced back at the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, thicker, and for a brief moment, I saw her again, just at the edge of the woods, watching me. I turned and ran, but now even back home, far from those woods, I still hear the whispering. Every night it grows louder. Every night it's closer, and I don't think I'll ever escape it. I always loved camping. The isolation, the quiet. Being completely disconnected from the world was something I craved. So when my buddy Mark suggested we head out to a remote spot in the Appalachians for the weekend, I jumped at the chance. It was the kind of place with no cell service, no people, just pure wilderness. We packed up the truck and set off early Friday morning. The drive was long, winding deeper and deeper into the mountains, until the road turned from asphalt to dirt. It felt like we were the only ones for miles. That kind of solitude was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. We finally reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. It was eerie how quiet it was. Not even birds. Just the crunch of our boots on the dry leaves and the whisper of the wind in the pines. We hiked a couple of miles into the woods until we found a spot to set up camp, an open clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. There was something almost suffocating about how thick the woods were, but we laughed it off. It's just nature, right? By the time we had our tents up, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. We built a fire, cracked open some beers, and sat back to relax. That's when the first strange thing happened. I was staring into the flames when I heard it, faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. My name. Jake! I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced at Mark, but he was busy poking at the fire, oblivious. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" he replied, not looking up. I shook it off. The wind, I told myself, just the wind. But deep down, something about it didn't feel right. That night, the forest was unnervingly silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of leaves, just dead, oppressive stillness. Every snap of a twig or crackle from the fire made me jump. I lay in my tent, staring up at the dark canvas, unable to sleep. And then, sometime in the early hours, I heard it again. "Jake." This time it was clearer, closer. It was as if someone was standing right outside my tent, whispering my name. I shot up, heart pounding in my chest. Mark's tent was just a few feet away, and I strained to hear him breathing. But all I could hear was the soft, steady rhythm of my own breath and the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to call out, to ask if he was awake, but something stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to, like speaking would draw something's attention. After what felt like hours, I must have fallen into a restless sleep. When I woke, The sun was up, and the forest had returned to its normal self. Birds chirping, the wind rustling the trees, as if the night before had been a bad dream. Mark was already up, making coffee by the fire, seemingly oblivious to the unease gnawing at me. We spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, exploring, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whole time, I felt eyes on me, like the forest itself was observing, waiting. There were moments when the wind would pick up and I could swear I heard my name again, carried on the breeze. Each time I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No one. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was beginning to set again. I dreaded the night. Mark, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, laughing and joking as we cooked dinner over the fire. I wanted to tell him what I'd heard, but I didn't. I didn't want him to think I was losing it. That night, as soon as darkness fell, the oppressive silence returned. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I lay in my tent, wide awake, every muscle tense, straining to hear anything. And then it came. Not a whisper this time, but a slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Crunch. 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 They were slow, purposeful, circling the camp. I held my breath, listening. The steps were too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding, and reached for the zipper of my tent. But I stopped. The footsteps had stopped too. Right outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there listening, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. When morning finally came, I stumbled out of my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. Mark's tent was open, but he wasn't there. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I circled the camp, looking for any sign of him. Nothing. I started to panic, my mind racing. Had he gone to get help? Was he messing with me? I had no idea, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my gear, trying to stay calm, and started hiking back toward the truck. The whole way I felt like I was being followed, but every time I turned around, there was nothing, just trees. Endless, suffocating trees. When I finally reached the truck, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my pack in the back and reached for the door, but then I stopped, frozen in place. There, on the driver's side window, was a handprint. Not just any handprint, Mark's. I'd recognize his wedding band anywhere. The thing is, it wasn't on the outside. It was on the inside. And scrawled in the dirt below it, scratched into the window with something sharp, was a single word. Jake. My blood ran cold. I hadn't seen him leave camp. I hadn't heard him. But somehow, he had beaten me back here. Or, whatever was pretending to be him had. I slowly backed away from the truck, feeling the weight of the forest closing in around me. I was alone, completely, utterly alone. I turned and ran. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away, just me, my brother Mark, and a couple days in the wild. We'd been going on camping trips together since we were kids, and every year we pushed a little deeper into the wilderness. This time, Mark had found a spot on an old map, miles away from the nearest trailhead, in a part of the forest neither of us had ever been to before. He was excited. I should have listened to that feeling in my gut, telling me something was wrong. We arrived just before sundown, parking the truck at the edge of an old logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The forest here was thick, wild. The trees were old and gnarled, their trunks wide enough that two people could barely wrap their arms around them. The canopy above was so dense it blocked out the late afternoon sun, casting everything below in deep shadow. "This is perfect," Mark said, grinning as he shouldered his pack. "No one's been out here in ages." I forced a smile. The isolation was a little more intense than I had imagined, but I didn't want to kill the mood. Mark thrived on this kind of thing. He always had, ever since we were kids. I followed him as we made our way deeper into the forest, the ground soft beneath our boots, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves thick in the air. We found a clearing after about an hour of hiking, just big enough for the two of us to set up our tents. It was quiet, too quiet in retrospect. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the steady sigh of the wind through the trees, and even that was barely a whisper. We built a fire as night fell, its light flickering across the twisted trees at the edge of the clearing. It was cold for early autumn, and the warmth of the fire felt comforting against the growing chill in the air. But that unease from earlier was still there, a prickling at the back of my neck I couldn't shake. As we sat by the fire, talking about old trips and joking around, I noticed something strange. A faint sound, almost like someone whispering. It was so soft that I thought it might have just been the wind, but it was there, just at the edge of hearing. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Mark looked at me, frowning. "Hear what?" "That whispering." He paused, listening. The fire crackled in the silence, but there was nothing else. "Just the wind, man," Mark said, shrugging. "This place is getting to you." I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The trees seemed to press in on us from all sides, their branches swaying gently despite the lack of any real breeze. And that whispering, it was like it was calling from somewhere deep in the woods, too far away to make out, but persistent, like it was getting closer. Mark didn't seem bothered at all. He stoked the fire, talking about all the stuff he wanted to do in the morning, exploring a nearby creek, hiking further into the valley, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the tree line, my eyes scanning for movement. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved, a dark shape slipping between the trees. It was quick, almost too fast to notice, but I caught it. A flicker of motion, a shadow that didn't quite fit with the rest of the night. "Mark," I whispered, my throat tight, "there's something out there." He looked at me again, clearly unconvinced, but I couldn't let it go. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack and pointing it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark and thick undergrowth. For a moment there was nothing, but then, at the edge of the light, I saw it again. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretched in ways that didn't make sense. It stood just beyond the reach of the flashlight, unmoving, watching us. "What the hell?" I muttered, backing up. Mark stood up, finally serious. "What? What do you see?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was looking at. The figure was standing completely still, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking. And then it moved. Not like a person. It didn't walk. It just shifted. One moment it was there. The next it was closer. Like the darkness itself had swallowed the space between us. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like 100 voices all speaking at once, but none of them were human. "Pack your stuff," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." Mark didn't argue. He must have seen the look on my face, the fear. We moved quickly, breaking camp in a matter of minutes. But as we did, the figure moved too, gliding closer with every second. The whispering surrounded us now, coming from every direction, from the trees, from the ground, from the very air around us. By the time we had everything packed, the figure was at the edge of the clearing. I could see it clearly now. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. Its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and where its face should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone. We didn't speak. We just ran. The trail back to the truck was a blur of branches and shadows, the whispering following us the entire way. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it behind me, hear it moving through the trees, closing the distance. When we finally reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Mark stood by the passenger door, eyes wide, scanning the dark forest around us. "Hurry," he whispered. and for the first time I heard fear in his voice. I got the door open, and we both jumped in. I started the engine, slamming the truck into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the old logging road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel it, whatever that thing was, watching us from the trees as we drove away. The whispering didn't fade until we were miles from the campsite, the forest finally giving way to open road and the distant lights of the highway. We didn't talk much after that. I don't think either of us wanted to acknowledge what we'd seen, what had followed us through the woods. But every now and then, late at night, I still hear it, the whispering. And I know deep down it's still out there waiting. I never liked camping much, but it wasn't my idea. It was Jake's. He's always been into these rugged, back-to-nature adventures, dragging the rest of us along with him. There were 5 of us that weekend. Me, Jake, Sam, Lily, and Claire. We were all crammed into Jake's beat-up Jeep, winding down a narrow, twisting dirt road that seemed to lead straight into the belly of nowhere. We finally arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, miles deep in the pine barrens, dense, remote, and eerily silent. The kind of silence that gets under your skin. Not a single bird call, no rustling of small animals. Just nothing. But Jake was thrilled. "Perfect spot," he said with that goofy grin. The rest of us exchanged uncertain glances, but no one wanted to be the first to chicken out. We set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It was peaceful at first, but there was something off about the place. You know that feeling when you're being watched? I brushed it off as nerves. Being out here, in the middle of nowhere, tends to do that. By nightfall, the fire was crackling, and we passed around beers, trying to lighten the mood. But something still felt wrong. Sam was the first to notice it. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, suddenly serious. We all fell silent. There it was, a faint whispering, barely audible, like the wind weaving through the trees. Except there wasn't any wind. We looked at each other, confused. Lily laughed it off, saying it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I could tell none of us believed her. The whispering grew louder as the night dragged on, like voices coming from all directions. But no matter where we looked, we saw nothing but the same black expanse of trees. And the silence between the whispers was suffocating. Jake tried to reassure us. "It's just the forest," he said, throwing another log on the fire. "Nature can play tricks on you when it's this quiet." But something about his voice sounded strained, like he didn't fully believe his own words. We all agreed to turn in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The tents felt too thin, too fragile, as if they couldn't protect us from whatever was out there. I lay awake, listening. The whispers were closer now, almost like they were coming from just outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Jake unzipped his tent and crawled out. I could see his silhouette against the faint glow of the dying fire. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound brave. No answer. Suddenly we all heard it, a low guttural growl from the trees. Claire screamed, and in seconds we were all out of our tents, flashlights scanning the darkness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching us. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the light, a figure, hunched and shadowy, barely visible through the dense pines. "Run!" Jake yelled, and we scattered, bolting through the forest without any sense of direction. The only thing that mattered was getting away from whatever was out there. Branches whipped against my face, the forest floor uneven beneath my feet. The growling seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My legs burned, but I kept running until I couldn't hear the others anymore, couldn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing. That's when I saw it, a small cabin tucked away in the trees. It looked old, abandoned. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar. I should have kept running, but something drew me to it, like an invisible hand guiding me. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Dust covered everything. An old table, a few wooden chairs, a fireplace filled with ashes long dead. But the thing that stopped me in my tracks was the wall, covered in names, dozens, maybe hundreds of names, scratched into the wood. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. That's when I saw it. Near the bottom of the wall, scratched deep into the wood, were our names: Jake, Sam, Lily, Claire, and mine. I stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. How? How could our names already be here? The door creaked open behind me and I spun around, expecting to see the thing from the woods. But it wasn't. It was Jake, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Did you see them too?" he whispered. I didn't have time to ask what he meant. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling the cabin with their eerie, disembodied voices. And then, like a switch flipping, they stopped. Silence. Jake and I stood there frozen, waiting for something, anything. That's when the floor creaked, and from the shadows of the far corner, something stepped forward. It wasn't the creature from the woods, it was Claire, or at least it looked like her. But there was something wrong. Her eyes, they were blank, lifeless. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin, and in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Jake bolted for the door and I followed, sprinting into the night. We ran, not caring where we were going, just needing to get away. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, we realized something terrifying. The forest was quiet again. No growls, no whispers, just the wind in the trees. But Claire was gone. So was Sam and Lily. We searched for hours, calling their names, but there was no sign of them. It wasn't until dawn broke that we found their tents, empty, torn open from the inside. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what happened to the others, or if they ever made it out. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and I can't help but wonder, did they ever really leave? Or are they still out there waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into the whispering pines? It was supposed to be an easy trip, just a short hike, a couple of nights under the stars, and a chance to disconnect from everything. My girlfriend Emily and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks, our first time out together in the wild. We chose a spot deep in the state forest, one of those places where cell service drops out, and you're really on your own. That's exactly what we wanted. The drive out was beautiful, the sun casting golden light over the trees as we wound deeper into the woods. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. We threw on our backpacks and started the hike, laughing, talking, the whole couple's adventure vibe. The trail was dense with trees, but it was well marked, and there was no one else around. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only two people for miles. The first weird thing happened not long after we set up camp. We'd found a great spot, a little clearing by a creek with enough flat space for the tent and a fire pit. As the sun started setting, we gathered firewood and cooked dinner, the smell of smoke and grilled food filling the air. Everything felt perfect, peaceful, until Emily froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I stopped what I was doing and listened. At first I heard nothing but the crackle of the fire and the soft gurgling of the creek. Then faintly I heard it, a low humming sound like a far-off drone, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. "What is that?" I asked, standing up and straining to hear. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was too steady, too mechanical. Emily looked at me with wide eyes, clearly unsettled. "Maybe it's a plane or something," I suggested, though I wasn't convinced. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from the forest, from beneath the trees, like something hidden in the shadows. But just as quickly as it started, the humming stopped. We both stood there for a moment waiting for it to come back, but the forest was silent again. Uneasily, we tried to shake it off and return to the fire. We told ourselves it was nothing, probably just a distant generator from a cabin or something we couldn't see. But the quiet that followed felt heavy, like the woods were listening. Later that night, we crawled into the tent. The fire had died down to embers, and the temperature had dropped, but I felt safe inside the tent with Emily beside me. As I started to drift off, I heard something else. A rustling, soft at first, then louder. It sounded like footsteps, someone, or something, walking just outside our campsite. I sat up, my heart racing. Emily stirred next to me. "What's wrong?" she asked groggily. "Shh," I whispered, listening again. The rustling was faint, but unmistakable, moving closer to the tent, circling around it. My breath caught in my throat. I fumbled for the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, shining the light out into the dark. Nothing. The forest was still. No animals, no intruders, just the trees and the quiet creek. I exhaled slowly and zipped the tent back up, telling myself it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. Emily fell back asleep quickly, but I stayed awake, listening, waiting. But the sounds didn't come back. The next morning, everything seemed fine again. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the eerie tension from the night before had disappeared. I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. After breakfast, we decided to go for a short hike before packing up to leave. We followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, enjoying the calm morning air. The trail looped around, and by midday, we were back at the camp, ready to pack up. And that's when we noticed the clock, and Emily's watch showed 2:15 p.m., which didn't seem right. We'd left for our hike around 9:30 and had only been gone for about 2 hours. But the time didn't add up. My phone, which had no service but still kept time, said the same thing, 2:15. "We couldn't have been out that long," Emily said, frowning. "No way," I agreed, my stomach twisting. I checked everything again, my watch, her phone, but the time was consistent. Somehow we'd lost more than 2 hours, but I couldn't explain it. We hadn't stopped for long and we hadn't gone far. It didn't make sense. I felt a wave of unease, but Emily shrugged it off, trying to stay optimistic. "Maybe we just lost track of time. Let's pack up and get out of here." I nodded, but the strange feeling lingered as we took down the tent and stuffed our gear back into our packs. As we started hiking back to the car, I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that we were being watched. The woods seemed different now, darker even though the sun was still shining. The trees felt like they were leaning in, listening, waiting. Halfway back to the car, Emily stopped in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. I listened. At first there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. Then I heard it again, the humming. Low, distant, but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere in the forest far behind us, but this time it was getting louder, closer. "We need to go," I said, grabbing her hand. We picked up the pace, practically jogging down the trail, the hum growing louder with every step. It was like the forest was alive, vibrating with that sound, and it was following us. I could feel it pressing in on my ears, rattling through my chest, filling my head with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. Finally, we reached the car. We threw our bags into the back seat and jumped inside. The moment the door slammed shut, the humming stopped. Silence fell over the woods like a curtain, heavy and unnatural. I turned the key and the engine sputtered to life. Without saying a word, I floored it, kicking up dirt as we sped away from the trailhead. Neither of us spoke on the drive back, the tension thick between us. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing. Just the empty road and the fading trees. When we got home, I checked my phone. The time synced up immediately, and everything seemed normal again. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about that missing hour. Where had it gone? What had happened to us out there in the woods? I never found an answer. But every once in a while, when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I hear it again. the low, distant hum just barely audible, like it's coming from somewhere far away, or somewhere much closer than I want to believe, and I know deep down that whatever followed us out of those woods is still watching. There were 4 of us, me, Ben, Sarah, and Nick. We were old college friends looking for a getaway, somewhere remote, quiet, where we could unplug from the stress of our lives. Nick found the place online, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, sitting right by the edge of a lake. The pictures made it look perfect, too perfect maybe. The drive out took hours, far from any town, and as we turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt trail, I remember thinking how cut off we really were. No cell service, no people. Just an endless stretch of towering pines and a suffocating sense of isolation. But we weren't worried then. If anything, it felt like a relief. The cabin was even more remote than I expected. The trees crowded in on all sides, making the place feel smaller than it was. The lake, though, God, the lake was beautiful. Still, glassy, and reflecting the sky in a way that seemed almost too serene. Something about that stillness felt unnatural, like the lake was holding its breath. But Ben was already unpacking, and Sarah and Nick were laughing, so I pushed the feeling aside. That first night, everything seemed normal. We built a fire outside, roasted marshmallows, told dumb stories from college. The moon was high, casting a silver sheen across the water. There was no noise except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft lap of the lake against the shore. At some point, Sarah asked, "Do you think anyone's ever drowned in this lake?" The question hung in the air, heavy. Nick laughed it off, calling her morbid, but I could tell the thought unsettled the group. Something about the lake had that effect. Its perfect stillness, the way it seemed to absorb sound. Ben broke the tension by cracking open another beer, but none of us quite shook the unease. Later, we headed inside, the fire dwindling to embers. It wasn't until I lay in bed, the darkness pressing in around me, that I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like someone walking around the cabin, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. I sat up, listening, waiting for one of the others to call out, to acknowledge they'd heard it too. But there was only silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. The woods were full of things that move in the night, right? Still, I couldn't sleep after that, my eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight slipping through the window, my ears straining for any more sounds. The next morning, I was the first one up. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool air, trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. That's when I noticed the footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin in the dirt. Bare footprints. My stomach turned. "Ben!" I yelled, calling him out. He came out of the cabin, yawning and rubbing his eyes. When I showed him the prints, his face went pale. "That's strange," he muttered, kneeling down to examine them. "They look fresh."
No.
We spent the morning trying to figure out where they came from. They led toward the lake, but there was no sign of anyone else around. The trail just stopped, vanished. Sarah suggested it was some local prankster, but something about the depth of those prints unnerved me. Whoever or whatever had made them had been standing right outside our windows. The second night was worse. It started with the tapping, light at first, just a few knocks against the cabin walls. Then more, like a steady rhythm echoing from outside. It was coming from all sides, like something, or someone, was circling the cabin again, tapping as they went. "Is someone out there?" Nick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. We were all frozen, listening. Then came the laughter. It was distant, soft, but unmistakable. A child's laugh, floating across the lake. It sent a chill down my spine, and when I looked at the others, their faces were drained of color. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaky. We all agreed. Whatever was happening wasn't normal. The place felt wrong, like the forest itself was watching us, and the lake, its surface was so unnaturally smooth, like glass. Not even the wind could disturb it. It was as if the water itself was hiding something. We packed in a frenzy, desperate to get out, but when we reached the car, Ben stopped dead in his tracks. The tires, they were flat, not just flat, but slashed, deep cuts in the rubber. Someone, or something, didn't want us leaving. Panic set in. We were trapped. No phone service, no way to drive out, and a long, long walk back to civilization. Ben and Nick tried to patch the tires, but we all knew it wasn't going to work. We were stuck for the night, whether we liked it or not. That evening, the lake seemed to glow under the moonlight, a pale, ghostly shimmer that felt wrong. We barricaded ourselves inside the cabin, pushing furniture against the doors, hoping it would be enough. Then, just after midnight, the whispering started, low, unintelligible murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart pounding. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were coming from beneath the cabin. I froze, and so did everyone else. We looked at each other, our fear mirrored in each other's faces. "Is there a basement?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. We hadn't even considered that. Ben, flashlight in hand, found the hatch in the corner of the cabin, hidden beneath a rug, a trap door sealed shut with heavy bolts. I don't know why, but I felt a deep, primal terror at the thought of opening it. Nick, ever the brave one, undid the bolts one by one. The hatch creaked open, releasing a gust of damp, moldy air. The whispers grew louder, clearer. And then the laughter returned. That same eerie, childlike giggle, now unmistakably coming from below. "Close it," I urged, but it was too late. Nick shone his flashlight down into the darkness, and we all saw it at once. A staircase leading down into the earth, and at the bottom, figures, pale, with wide black eyes staring back up at us. They were grinning, their mouths too wide, too full of teeth. We slammed the hatch shut, but it didn't matter. The whispering didn't stop. That was last night, the car still unusable. The forest feels closer now, like it's tightening around the cabin, and the lake, it's not still anymore. The water's churning like something underneath is waking up. I don't know if we'll make it out, but if you're hearing this, if someone finds this recording, don't come here. Don't come to the cabin by the lake, because once you do, you won't leave.